The roadhouse had no name worth remembering. It sat off Interstate 80 like something the highway had coughed up and forgotten. A low-weathered building of dark timber and corrugated steel, squatting in the high desert scrub of northern Nevada, where the sage flats stretched out flat and pale under a sky that offered no mercy and no shade and no particular interest in whether you lived or died out here. The sign above the door was missing two letters, and nobody had bothered to fix it in 11 years. The parking lot was cracked asphalt bleeding back into gravel, and the gravel was bleeding back into dirt, and the dirt was slowly reclaiming everything. The way the desert always eventually reclaimed everything, out here patiently, without malice, simply by continuing to exist. It was 2 in the afternoon on a Tuesday in July, and the heat outside was the kind that didn't just sit on you. It pressed down. A physical weight, a hand on the back of your neck turning the air above the asphalt into a shimmering liquid hallucination that made the tree line across the highway look like it was breathing. Inside the roadhouse, the temperature dropped maybe 10 degrees, which still left it brutally hot, the ceiling fans doing nothing but pushing the same stale, beer-soaked air in slow, useless circles overhead. Vance sat alone in the back booth. He had been sitting there since 11 that morning, which was when he'd ridden in from the property outside Lovelock, where he kept a trailer and a collection of half-finished machines, and the silence of a man who had stopped expecting company. He had ordered black coffee from Whitlow, who had poured it without comment because Whitlow never commented on anything, which was precisely why Vance had been drinking at this particular bar for 19 years. The coffee had gone cold an hour ago. He hadn't ordered more. He was 52 years old, and he felt every one of those years in his body, the way you feel a long highway in your joints after a hard ride, a deep structural ache that ibuprofen touched only at the edges. His knuckles were swollen, the arthritis advancing steadily through the architecture of his hands, the way rust advances through old iron, patient and inevitable. His beard was more gray than black now, a heavy, unkempt growth that had stopped being a style choice, somewhere around the time he stopped caring about style choices. His shoulders were still wide, his frame still massive under the heavy leather cut that bore the winged death's head patch of the Hells Angels over his left breast. But the mass was different now. It was the density of old timber rather than fresh muscle, hardened by time, slower to move, no less dangerous. He had a headache that had been living behind his left eye since Sunday. The roadhouse was a cavernous, dusty space that vibrated faintly with the low electrical hum of a neon Coors sign buzzing in the front window. The red light it cast reached halfway across the room and died, leaving the back half of the bar in a permanent, comfortable gloom that Vance had always appreciated. The floorboards were old pine black, with decades of absorbed spills, and they creaked in specific spots that every regular had memorized the way you memorize the geography of a place you've spent too much of your life inside. The pool tables in the middle of the room sat idle, their green felt faded to the color of old moss. The jukebox in the corner was dark and silent. Nobody had fed it quarters yet. At the bar, Whitlow moved with the unhurried economical motion of a man who had been performing the same tasks in the same space for so long that his body did them without instruction. He was wiping down the oak surface with a gray rag, working in slow, methodical circles, not cleaning so much as maintaining a ritual. He was somewhere in his late 50s, lean and weathered, with a face that looked like it had been left out in the Nevada sun for several consecutive decades. He did not look up. He did not look at anything in particular. He simply wiped. In the corner near the jukebox, Briggs stood with his thick arms crossed over his chest, staring at nothing with the focused vacancy of a man running internal calculations that had nothing to do with the room around him. Briggs was built like a load-bearing wall, wide, dense, apparently immovable. His forearms were covered in faded prison ink that had blurred at the edges with age. The images, no longer fully legible, absorbed back into skin the way everything eventually got absorbed back into what it came from. He had not spoken in 2 hours, which was not unusual for Briggs. Briggs was a man who treated words the way some men treated money, spent them carefully, hoarded them by instinct, Never wasted one on something that silence could handle just as well. Vance pressed his callous thumb into his left temple and held it there, applying steady pressure against the throb that pulsed behind his eye in a slow, insistent rhythm. He stared at the surface of his cold coffee. A thin, iridescent film had formed on top the way it always did when coffee sat too long in a ceramic mug in dry air. He found the film deeply offensive in a vague, unfocused way that had nothing to do with coffee and everything to do with the general condition of the afternoon. He was thinking about nothing in particular, which was the specific, carefully maintained mental state he'd spent 30 years cultivating the ability to sit in a room and think about absolutely nothing, to let the mind idle at low frequency, to exist in the present moment, with no past pulling at the edges and no future demanding attention. It was a discipline. It required constant, invisible effort. It was the only form of peace available to a man like Vance, and he protected it with the same ferocity he'd once protected territory. The heavy wooden front door did not open. It was slammed inward. The sound was a flat, percussive bang that hit the tin ceiling and bounced back down through the room like a physical impact. The door swung on its rusted hinges and crashed against the interior wall, and through the opening came a blast of blinding white July light so intense it momentarily erased everything. The bar, the pool tables, the neon sign, replacing it all with a rectangle of pure, scorching Nevada afternoon. Vance did not flinch. His right hand dropped off the tabletop with the slow, practiced casualness of a reflex that bypassed conscious thought, entirely drifting down to rest near the heavy steel buckle of his belt. At the bar, Whitlow's rag stopped moving. Briggs in the corner uncrossed his arms. The silence that fell was immediate and of a very specific quality, not the ordinary quiet of an empty afternoon bar, but the loaded, pressurized silence of men who have spent their lives in environments where sudden sounds have sudden meanings, and who have learned that the first 2 seconds after an unexpected intrusion are the most important 2 seconds in any situation. It wasn't cops. The posture was wrong. Cops carried a specific geometry when they entered a room, wide, deliberate hands visible and communicating authority. This was something else entirely. It was a blur, small, frantic, moving with the low, scrabbling speed of something cornered and running on pure animal terror. Vance's eyes had not yet fully adjusted from the glare when the blur hit the floorboards. He heard it before he fully saw it. The frantic, high-pitched squeak of cheap rubber soles on old pine, a sound completely out of place in this room, like bird song in an engine bay. The blur resolved itself into a shape as his vision recalibrated: small arms, small legs, an oversized shirt, the color of old concrete that might have once been pink, flying off one bony shoulder. Moving on hands and knees across the floor with the terrifying, unthinking speed of a creature that had stopped calculating options and was operating on nothing but the imperative to find a dark place and disappear into it. She did not look at Whitlow behind the bar. She did not look at Briggs by the jukebox. She looked at Vance. Or rather, she looked at the darkest corner of the room, the back booth, the place where the neon light from the front window gave up its reach, where the shadows settled thick and permanent, regardless of the time of day. And Vance happened to be sitting in it. She crossed the floor in 4 seconds. Vance watched her come with the slightly stunned sequential processing of a man whose brain was catching up to events slightly behind the events themselves. He had time to register small, dirty, moving too fast for a child in a bar, terrified, and then she was under his table. He felt a rush of displaced air against his shins. He looked down. She was crammed into the corner where the booth's back wall met the base of the table, making herself into the smallest possible version of herself, knees pulled to her chest, arms wrapped around them, spine pressed flat against the wooden paneling. The space between his boots and the wall was perhaps 18 inches. She had fit herself into it with the practiced compression of someone who had spent time in small dark spaces before and knew how to use them. She was shaking, not trembling. Shaking, a full-body involuntary vibration that rattled her thin shoulders and made her teeth click together at irregular intervals. The kind of shaking that comes not from cold, but from the body running too much adrenaline through a system too small to process it cleanly. He could smell her. Even over the ambient stench of the bar, the stale beer and the pine floor wax, in the decades of absorbed tobacco smoke, he could smell her. Sour childhood sweat, playground dirt, the dry mineral kind you got in the high desert. And underneath it, something sharper and more disturbing, the thin metallic scent of pure fear, the biological chemistry of an animal that believed it was about to be caught. She looked up at him. Her face was streaked with grime, pale skin mapped with the tracks of earlier tears now dried to salt. Her hair was dark reddish-brown, tangled and matted against the side of her face. Her eyes were gray, a pale, washed-out gray that caught even the dim light of the booth and threw it back with an intensity that had nothing to do with color and everything to do with the absolute concentrated desperation behind them. She was 7, maybe 8 years old. On her left cheekbone, a bruise was blooming. It was at the stage between fresh and settled, the colors not yet fully committed, cycling through deep purple at the center and a sickly greenish yellow at the edges. It pushed the skin there, slightly tight, slightly shiny. It was not an accidental bruise. Vance had seen enough bruises in his life to read their biographies at a glance, and this one had been written deliberately by something harder and larger than the child's small face. Vance stared at her. His mind was doing the sluggish, reluctant work of processing a situation that violated every established parameter of his afternoon. He was a patched member of the Hells Angels. He had been a patched member for 26 years. He dealt in the currency of violence and intimidation and the particular authority that comes from being genuinely, documentably dangerous. His world operated on a set of rules that were unwritten but absolute. And one of those rules was that children did not enter it because children meant exposure, and exposure meant the end of everything. His immediate instinct was territorial and irritated. The word forming in his throat was a single syllable, low and dismissive, a sound more than a word designed to expel her the way you'd expel something that had wandered into the wrong space through the wrong door. Before he could produce the sound, she leaned forward. Her face came to within 6 inches of the scuffed steel toe of his boot. Her breathing was ragged and shallow, pulling air in small, rapid hitches that suggested her lungs were not fully cooperating. She looked up at him from under the tangle of her dirty hair. "Can I hide here?" The words were barely audible. Not a plea, something raw and more broken than a plea. A plea still contained some expectation of being heard. This was something scraped down past expectation to pure exposed need. 3 words delivered in a whisper, worn down to nothing by whatever had happened to her before she hit those doors. Vance did not answer. He looked at the bruised cheekbone. He looked at the dirt packed under her fingernails, packed so deep it suggested hours of accumulation, not minutes. He looked at the pulse at the base of her thin neck, visible and rapid fluttering like something trying to escape a cage. He felt a dull, unwelcome ache settle somewhere in the region behind his sternum. Not pain exactly, more like the ghost of an old injury registering a change in barometric pressure. He shifted his leg, a subtle lateral movement, a physical signal that said, "This is not a playground. This is not a shelter. You have the wrong man in the wrong place." She did not flinch away. Instead, a small dirt-stained hand shot out from between her knees. Her fingers, tiny, freezing cold despite the July heat, the nails bitten to the quick, clamped around the thick scuffed denim covering his shin. She gripped him with a force completely disproportionate to her size. Her knuckles went white. The tendons in her small wrists stood out like cables under skin. The contact sent something up through Vance's leg that he had no adequate word for. Not warmth, not sympathy exactly. Something more structural, the sensation of a load being transferred, of weight shifting from one point of contact to another. She was not simply hiding under a table. She had reached out in the dark and grabbed the nearest solid thing and was holding on with everything she had. He was at that particular moment the nearest solid thing. The front door, which had swung partially closed on its own momentum, groaned open again. The girl sucked in a breath so sharp it was audible even over the ambient hum of the bar. Her entire body went rigid. The shaking stopped, replaced by a terrible statue-still tension that was somehow worse than the shaking had been. She pressed her face into her own knees and squeezed her eyes shut, and her grip on Vance's jeans tightened until he could feel her fingernails pressing through the denim into his skin. Vance did not look under the table again. He slowly lifted his gaze, straightened his spine against the cracked vinyl back of the booth, and rested both forearms on the sticky tabletop. He let his face settle into what people who had spent time around him knew as his resting expression, a heavy granite blankness that communicated nothing and absorbed everything. His jaw ticked once, then stilled. The man who came through the door brought a different atmosphere with him entirely. Where the girl's smell was the sharp, organic smell of fear and childhood, and the outdoors his was something chemical and artificial. The acrid, sour reek of a body-burning stimulants as its primary fuel source layered over 3 days of unwashed clothing and stale cigarette smoke, and something sweet and synthetic underneath it all. Vance recognized it immediately. He had been in proximity to this chemistry his entire adult life. It was the metabolic signature of someone running hard on methamphetamine. He was thin. Thin in the way that meth makes people thin, not lean, not fit, but hollowed out, the fat stripped away, and then the muscle beginning to follow, leaving behind a frame that looked like something structural had been removed from the inside. His skin had the grayish-yellow cast of a man who processed more amphetamines than oxygen on a daily basis. His eyes were wide, the pupils blown out to black discs that swallowed almost all the iris too wide for the dim interior of the bar. The kind of pupils you saw in someone whose nervous system had been running at maximum voltage for too long and couldn't remember how to dial back. He stood in the doorway with his chest heaving and his head swiveling in rapid, jerky arcs, scanning the room. His jaw was working without producing sound, a constant, involuntary grinding. His hands were moving at his sides, fingers opening and closing in a twitching rhythm that Vance associated with men running on glass. The body's attempt to discharge electricity it had no other outlet for. Vance had known men like this his entire adult life. The club had sold product to men like this. He had watched 100 different iterations of this specific deterioration. The tools pawned, then the car, then the furniture, then the things that couldn't be replaced, then finally the things that shouldn't ever be touched. He held no illusions about his own position in that ecosystem. He was not a hero in that story. He was part of the machinery. But right now in his bar on his afternoon, this twitching wreck was vibrating at a frequency that made the fillings in Vance's back teeth ache. "Hey!" The man's voice cracked on the single syllable, splitting into 2 registers simultaneously. He took a staggering half step toward the bar, catching himself on the edge of a pool table. "Hey, you see a kid come in here." Whitlow did not look up. He had picked up his gray rag again and was applying it to a section of bar that required no attention, moving in the same slow, meditative circles. He wiped with the unhurried concentration of a man who had been asked no question and heard no voice. In the corner, Briggs turned his head. A slow, deliberate rotation like a gun turret acquiring a target. He looked at the man in the doorway with an expression of such complete, impenetrable blankness that it was more unsettling than any visible hostility would have been. He said nothing. He simply looked. "I asked you a question." The man's voice climbed desperation, sharpening its edges into something approaching aggression. He slapped his palm down on the pool table's rail, a damp, flat sound. "A little girl, pink shirt. She ran in here. I saw her come in." Under the table, the vibration in the small hand gripping Vance's leg changed character. It was no longer the vibration of exhausted fear. It was the vibration of targeted, specific terror, the frequency of a body that has heard a known voice and knows with absolute certainty what that voice means. The girl was hyperventilating. The sound of it was too small to carry across the room. Tiny, rapid inhalations, barely more than the movement of air, but Vance could feel the rhythm of it transmitted through her hand and up through his shin. She had pressed her forehead against the toe of his boot. He felt a faint dampness through the old leather tears, or sweat, or both. Vance felt something he would have described if pressed as profound inconvenience. He hated the feeling of being made complicit in something he hadn't chosen. He was a Hell's Angel. His authority in any room he entered was structural. It preceded him. surrounded him was built into the physics of his presence, the way gravity was built into mass. He didn't earn it every day. It simply was. And yet here, in the back booth of his own roadhouse, 70 pounds of terrified child had effectively immobilized him, turned him from the most dangerous person in the room into a piece of furniture she was hiding behind. He found this deeply, almost philosophically irritating. "We're closed," Whitlow said. The two words were delivered in a tone of such complete emotional flatness that they contained no information other than themselves. Not unfriendly, not threatening, simply a statement of fact from a man who had no apparent awareness that facts could be disputed. The door was open. The man scratched frantically at the side of his neck, fingers raking back and forth over skin already raw and irritated from previous raking. His eyes were moving in quick darting circuits around the room, touching each corner and coming back unsatisfied. "I know she came in here. She's my responsibility. She ran off. Kids, man, you know how they..." He produced a laugh that had no humor in it whatsoever, a dry scraping sound like a gate on a broken hinge. "Little brats." No one in the room returned the laugh. The silence that followed had mass and temperature. It pressed outward from the three men in the room, Vance at his booth, Whitlow at his bar, Briggs at his corner, and it filled the space between them and the man at the door until the man could feel it against his skin. He felt it. Vance could see the exact moment it registered the slight change in the man's posture, the way the aggressive forward lean began to recede, replaced by something more uncertain. His eyes moved again faster now. They found Whitlow's blank face. They found Briggs's dead-eyed stillness. Then they moved to the back of the room, to the shadowed booth, to Vance. Vance let the man look. He did not adjust his expression. He did not lean forward or back. He simply existed in the booth with the heavy, settled mass of something that had been in that spot for a very long time and intended to remain in it. He met the man's blown-out pupils with eyes that were the flat, dark gray of old roadway. Not angry, not threatening in any performative sense, simply present in the way that a geological feature is present. Immovable, indifferent to whether it inconvenienced you. "Hey, you!" The man pointed a finger, a thin, trembling thing toward the back of the room. "You sitting back there, you see her little girl, she'd have come in just a minute ago." Under the table, the girl's grip spasmed. She tried reflexively to pull her hand away from his jeans, as if realizing that contact might somehow telegraph her location. But her fingers were locked. They had been clenched too long and the muscles had cramped around the denim and wouldn't release. Vance inhaled slowly through his nose. The air tasted of dust and old smoke, and the chemical ghost of the man's sweat drifting across the room. "I didn't see anything," Vance said. His voice did not cross the room. It commanded the room to come to it. It was a low, rough sound produced from somewhere deeper than the throat, more vibration than volume, the way a large engine idles differently than a small one. It carried no inflection that could be read as invitation or hostility. It was simply a statement of fact delivered by a man who did not anticipate the need to repeat himself. The man's Adam's apple moved in his skinny throat. He swallowed hard. The aggressive energy was curdling now, uncertainty eating at its foundation. He could feel the room, feel the texture of a space that had decided it was done with him. "Look, man." His hands came up, palms out, a gesture trying to be conciliatory and landing somewhere closer to desperate. "I ain't looking for trouble. I gotta get her home. Her mother's going to..." "Then you should go look for her," Vance said. "Outside. She's in here. I know she came in here. I'm going to take a look around, that's all." He took a step away from the pool table, moving toward the center of the room, trying to build momentum in a direction he had not yet fully committed to. "Just a quick look, that's all." He took another step. The sound of Whitlow setting his rag down on the bar was small and precise, a single sharp sound in a room that had otherwise gone absolutely still. Whitlow did not say anything. He simply reached one hand below the bar in a slow, unhurried motion and left it there out of sight, and the implication of that gesture hung in the air like low barometric pressure before a storm. Briggs stepped away from the wall. He did not move toward the man. He simply stopped leaning and stood upright. And the difference between Briggs leaning against a wall and Briggs standing upright was the difference between a parked vehicle and a running engine. The width of him, the density of him, the absolute quiet of him, it all recalibrated the geometry of the room in a single motion. The man stopped. His frantic eyes did their circuit one more time, Whitlow's hand below the bar. Briggs's stillness, the back booth. He was doing math. The math was not coming out in his favor, and some surviving fragment of his survival instinct was delivering the results clearly, if not eloquently. "You got a hearing problem?" Vance asked. He leaned forward, a slow, deliberate shift of his mass onto his forearms, pressing them into the sticky tabletop. The leather of his cut groaned faintly at the movement. He kept his voice at the same low register, the same flat, even cadence, the tone of a man explaining something simple to someone who should have understood it already. "We're closed. I don't know anything about a kid, and you're bleeding your tweaked-out smell all over my floor." He paused for exactly one beat. "You've got about 5 seconds to turn around and walk back out that door. After that, you're leaving through the window." He did not indicate which window. There was no need to be specific. The man's mouth opened. His jaw worked silently for a moment. He looked at Vance's eyes, really looked at them, and found there the quality of stillness that distinguishes men who are performing threat from men who are simply describing an available future. Vance was doing the latter. There was nothing in his face that wanted a confrontation. Nothing that needed one. He would break this man's nose and go back to his cold coffee with the same emotional register as swatting a fly. And the man could see this, and seeing it completed the math in a way that produced a very clear answer. He threw his hands up. "Fine." The word came out tight and strangled. "Screw this. Screw you guys." He took 2 backward steps, stumbled slightly against the doorframe, caught himself. His eyes made one last sweep of the room, landing on the back booth, staying there a half-second too long, and then he pushed through the door, and the blast of white afternoon light swallowed him, and the door swung shut behind him with a heavy final thud. The silence came back, but the texture of it had changed. The previous silence had been the quiet of a roadhouse on a slow afternoon, inert, dusty, habitual. This silence was different. It was the silence after something the quiet that settles over a space when an immediate problem has been resolved, but its implications remain in the room, visible to everyone, addressed by no one. Whitlow brought his hand back above the bar. He picked up his rag. Briggs returned to his wall. Neither of them looked at the back booth. They were giving Vance room the way you give room to a man who has just made a decision whose consequences haven't yet fully arrived. Vance sat still. Under the table, the girl was not shaking less. She was shaking more, the adrenaline of the acute threat dissolving into the less organized crisis of its aftermath. Her small body flooded with chemistry it didn't know how to metabolize. Her forehead was still pressed against the toe of his boot. The cramped grip on his jeans had not released. He could hear her breathing, ragged and shallow and catching on itself, trying to find a regular rhythm and failing. Small broken sounds at the top of each inhale, not quite crying, too exhausted for crying, just the raw, involuntary sounds of a system pushed past its processing capacity. Vance sat with it for a long moment. He stared at the cold film on his untouched coffee. He listened to Whitlow's rag on the bar. He listened to the hum of the neon Coors sign. He listened to the small, wrecked sound of a child trying to breathe normally in the space between his boots. Then he sighed. It was a long, heavy exhalation, the sound of 52 years of accumulated weight shifting position. He pushed his coffee mug to the side with one thick finger. He braced both hands on the edge of the table. His bad knees popped like distant gunshots as he stood, and he felt the protest of every joint from his ankles to his hips as he unfolded himself from the booth to his full height. He stood over the edge of the table for a moment, not bending down, giving her the time to register the change, that the immediate threat was gone, that the enormous leather-clad figure above her was not the same category of thing as the twitching man who had just left. "He's gone," Vance said. He kept his voice at the low register, but he took out the gravel, or as much of it as his voice allowed. The result was not soft. Exactly, his voice was constitutionally incapable of soft, but it was quieter, directed downward, not at the room. From under the table, nothing but the continued ragged breathing. Vance lowered himself into a crouch. His knees made their complaints at full volume, and he ignored them, dropping down until he was looking into the shadows beneath the table. She was still pressed against the wall, still making herself as small as physics allowed, still staring at him with those pale gray eyes, doing the calculation, the constant exhausting calculus of a child who has spent enough time around dangerous people to know that the removal of one threat doesn't guarantee the arrival of safety. She was reassessing him. He could see it, the rapid, detailed read she was running on everything available. His face, his hands, his posture, the distance between his body and the exit. She had the hypervigilant situational awareness of someone trained by bad experience to never stop reading the room, not even for a second. "You can come out," he said. She shook her head. A tiny, rapid, side-to-side movement. Vance felt the helplessness of having no tools appropriate for the situation. His hands were built for gripping handlebars and turning wrenches, and when necessary, doing damage. His vocabulary ran toward the functional and the profane. He had not in the course of his adult life been required to perform gentleness, and the absence of practice showed clearly in this moment. He looked at her small, battered face, the bruise, the dried salt tracks on her cheeks, the dirt in the fine creases around her eyes. He reached his right hand under the table. It was a large hand scarred across the knuckles. The tattoos on his fingers faded and blurring at the edges with age, the skin roughened by decades of mechanical work in desert weather. He did not reach toward her. He laid his hand on the floorboards in the middle space between them, palm up. An offer rather than an action. A statement of availability. She stared at his hand. It was objectively a terrifying hand. He was aware of this. The jukebox in the corner hummed faintly, not playing just its internal electronics running. The neon sign buzzed its slow, steady buzz. Somewhere outside on the interstate, a truck changed gears with a distant mechanical moan. Then slowly, with the agonizing deliberateness of a decision being made in real time against significant internal resistance, she uncurled one arm from around her knees. Her small hand emerged from the shadow, hovering over his palm for a long moment, trembling visibly. And then her fingers dropped into his hand, light as paper, cold as water from a tap. He closed his fingers around them gently and drew her out. She crawled from the shadows on stiff, cramped limbs, unwilling to release his hand until she had both feet flat on the floorboards and was standing upright beside the booth. She came up to the middle of his thigh. She stood blinking in the dim bar light, her oversized shirt hanging off one shoulder, the grime on her skin visible now in the full relief of standing. Her feet were bare inside a pair of dirty canvas sneakers, 2 sizes too large, the laces unknotted and trailing. She looked around the room. Her eyes found Whitlow. He was staring at the taps resolutely elsewhere, and then Briggs, who had turned back to face his corner with the precise timing of a man who had seen nothing and intended to continue seeing nothing. Then she looked up at Vance. She smelled of stale fear and cheap laundry soap and dry desert dirt. She looked like something the highway had deposited, weathered-worn, arrived by accident, at a place that was not designed to receive her. Vance looked down at her. Then he looked over at Whitlow. "Whitlow!" The bartender looked up. "Glass of water and whatever we've got back there that isn't alcohol." Whitlow held his gaze for exactly 1 second, long enough to communicate that he had registered the full weight of what was happening, processed it, and decided it was not his business to have opinions about. And then he nodded once and turned toward the back. Vance looked back down at the girl. "Sit," he said, gesturing to the vinyl bench he just vacated. She looked at the bench. She looked at him. Then she grabbed the edge of the seat with both hands, hoisted herself up, and settled into the corner of it, with her knees pulled to her chest and her hands folded in her lap, occupying as little of the wide vinyl bench as her small body could manage. Vance sat down across from her heavily, his joints announcing themselves in the full catalog of their current complaints. He crossed his arms over his chest. The leather of his cut creaked. He looked at her bruised face. He looked at the dirt on her clothes, the haunted, watchful stillness that had replaced the acute terror, not the stillness of peace, but the stillness of a creature that has found temporary cover and is waiting to see what emerges from the next direction. Whitlow appeared at the edge of the booth. He set down a heavy-bottomed glass tumbler of water. Water sloshed over the rim onto the cracked vinyl, and he ignored this, and beside it a white paper plate holding two slices of soft white bread with a thick, uneven smear of peanut butter spread between them. No jelly, no knife, the functional minimum. He turned and walked away without a word. Vance watched the girl's eyes lock onto the plate. The transformation was immediate and absolute. Everything else in her field of attention, the room, the men, the exits, Vance himself temporarily ceased to exist. Her eyes fixed on the food with a focus that had nothing to do with preference or appetite, and everything to do with something much older and more fundamental. Her hands came out of her lap before she'd made any visible decision to move them. She grabbed the sandwich, both slices together, the bread compressing under her grip. She shoved a large corner into her mouth and chewed with her whole jaw, fast and mechanical. The peanut butter was dry and dense, and it caught in her throat, immediately triggering a hard, hacking cough that shook her entire frame. "Drink," Vance said. He nudged the glass an inch toward her. She dropped the bread, grabbed the glass in both hands, lifted it with slightly trembling arms, and drank in long, urgent swallows. Water ran down her chin, cutting a clean path through the grime dripping off her jaw and soaking into the collar of her oversized shirt. She set the glass down with a clunk, picked up the bread again, and resumed eating. Vance watched her. He had seen men eat this way. Men coming off county lockup, men who'd come in from 3 days on the road with no money. Men who'd been through the variety of hard time that strips a person down to their component parts and leaves only the body's most basic instructions running. The mechanical urgency of it. The constant peripheral scanning, even while the hands were busy with food, the eyes checking doors, checking faces, prepared at any moment for the meal to be interrupted or taken. She ate like someone who did not fundamentally believe the plate would still be there in the next moment. Vance looked away from her. He stared out the front window at the blinding white obliteration of the Nevada afternoon. He could see the heat shimmering off the asphalt of the parking lot in waves, liquid and distorting. The roadhouse's shadow stretched toward the tree line at the far edge of the property, thin and dark and precise against the bleached dirt. He was 52 years old, and he had lived his entire adult life by a set of principles that were not moral principles in any conventional sense, but were structural rules that kept a specific kind of operation running in a specific kind of world. Chief among them was the principle of invisibility. You did not attract attention. You did not collect problems that belonged to other people. You did not let the chaos of the civilian world spill across the threshold of the places where you conducted your business. He was aware that he had just violated this principle comprehensively and in full view of his club brothers. He was aware that the consequences of this violation were not yet visible, but were certainly en route. He was also aware with a particular exhausted clarity that comes from sitting in a dim bar at 2 in the afternoon with a headache and cold coffee and no remaining will to perform emotions he wasn't having, that he had absolutely no intention of undoing what he'd done. "What's your name?" he asked. His voice came out too loud for the quiet of the booth, too rough for the size of her. He didn't know how to fix either of these things. She stopped chewing. Her cheeks were full, stuffed with bread. She stared at him over the rim of the glass, her gray eyes cautious, calculating. Her gaze traveled to the death's head patch on his cut, the grinning winged skull above his left breast, and stayed there for a moment before returning to his face. Vance held eye contact and kept his face still. "I'm not going to hurt you," he said. He paused. "And I'm not letting that man back inside." He waited. "You can swallow." She swallowed. It looked uncomfortable. She took a careful sip of water. "Della," she whispered. The word barely made it across the table. Della, Vance repeated. The name felt unfamiliar in his mouth, light, almost fragile, a word built for different rooms than this one. Okay, Della, who was that man? She looked back down at the plate. Her fingernails were bitten to the quick, the skin around the cuticles red and torn. She picked up a small piece of bread that had fallen off the sandwich. Pruitt, she said. Pruitt, your dad? She shook her head. A quick, definitive movement. Mom's friend. Vance ground his back teeth together. He knew those two words the way you know a road you've driven 1,000 times, every rut, every landmark. In every small town from Reno to the state line, in every one of the repetitive tragedies that played out in the roadhouses and the trailer parks and the broke-down apartment complexes that lined the routes he'd ridden for 30 years, those two words covered the same geography. A revolving door. Men who arrived and consumed and destroyed and moved on, leaving damage in the casual and personal way that a storm leaves damage not out of malice, specifically just out of what they were. He looked at the bruise on her cheekbone. The light in the bar was dim enough that the colors of it were muted, but the shape was not the slightly raised contour of it, the careful way she was holding the left side of her face away from any possibility of contact. Pruitt hit you, Vance said. He kept his voice level. A statement, not a question. Della shrank back into the vinyl. Her shoulders came up around her ears. She stared at the plate. She didn't answer. She didn't need to. Vance looked away. He stared at the neon Coors sign in the front window, its red light pulsing at its small, steady frequency. He was not a moral man. He had built his life on the explicit rejection of the systems and authorities that other people use to organize their sense of right and wrong. He had done things, specific real things, in specific real places that those systems would never forgive and that he had never asked forgiveness for. But there were rules that existed below morality, below law, below the formal structures of any organization he'd ever been part of. Rules that came from somewhere older and less articulable. Rules that the worst men he'd ever known still held, even if they held nothing else. You did not put your hands on children. Why did he hit you? Vance asked. Della was quiet for a long moment. The jukebox in the corner had begun to hum more distinctly, its internal components warming. Whitlow moved behind the bar in his slow, meditative way. My bike, Della said finally. Her voice was barely above a whisper. She said it the way you say a word that means more than the word itself, the way you name something that no longer exists. Your bicycle. She nodded, a minimal movement. It was pink. She looked at her hands. It had streamers on the handlebars. White ones. A pause. My grandma bought it for me before she died. She swallowed again, and this time it wasn't because of the peanut butter. Pruitt put it in the back of his truck. I saw him. I tried to hold on to the wheel and I told him no. Her voice had gone flat, recitative, the tone of someone reporting facts they have already processed past the point of being able to cry about them. I screamed. He got mad because I was making noise. So he hit me. A pause. Then he locked me in the closet. Vance's jaw muscles tightened. He could feel the pressure of it traveling up into his temples, adding a new register to the headache that had been living there since Sunday. How did you get out? He passed out, Della said. He forgot the deadbolt on the front door. I pushed the screen out of the closet window. She glanced up at him briefly, then back down. I just ran. She was quiet for a moment. Then very softly, in a voice that had gone almost inaudible, he said if I ever ran, he'd find me and cut my fingers off. The words landed in the booth like something dropped from a height. Vance looked at the small hands resting in her lap, the bitten nails, the cold skin, the white knuckles. He looked at the girl who had crawled under his table and wrapped those hands around his leg with every ounce of strength her small body could produce. He looked at his own hands resting on the tabletop, the heavy, blunt-scarred instruments of a man who had spent his life in a world built on force. Something moved in his chest, a deep tectonic shift below the level of thought or decision. Not sentiment, not the warm, performed emotion of someone deciding to care about something. Something colder and more fundamental than that. Something that did not ask his permission before it arrived. The words touched something he had locked away 20 years ago, a specific room in a specific part of himself that he did not open. The room contained things he had done and things he had failed to do, and the outcome of both. He felt the door of it move against its lock just slightly, and he pressed it shut again with the full weight of practiced habit and continued looking at Della. Before he could speak, the floorboards began to vibrate. The vibration arrived through the soles of his boots before the sound did a low, rhythmic thrum rising through the old pine boards, traveling up through the table legs and into the sticky surface under his arms. Then the sound came rolling in from outside with a volume that was less heard than felt. Not one engine, not two, but four high-displacement V-twins running hard off the interstate, shifting down in a staggered aggressive sequence as they swung off the highway and into the dirt lot outside the deceleration, producing a series of sharp, cracking backfires that echoed off the steel skin of the building like rifle shots. Della flinched hard. Both hands flew to cover her ears, her eyes squeezing shut, her whole upper body contracting toward the center, as if trying to get smaller in response to the sound. She had the reaction to loud, unexpected noise of a child who had spent time around volatile people, the involuntary full-body startle of someone whose nervous system had been trained to treat sudden sounds as threats first and accidents second. Vance did not flinch, but he felt the weight of what those engines meant settle across his shoulders before the bikes had fully stopped in the lot outside. The engines cut out one after another in a staggered mechanical chorus that left behind a ringing silence quickly filled with the creak of cooling metal and the crunch of boots on gravel. The front door opened. This time it was kicked. The bang of it against the wall was harder than when Della had come through. Deliberate rather than desperate, the entrance of men who kicked doors open because they owned the rooms on the other side of them and who had never once in their adult lives considered doing otherwise. 4 men walked in. They brought the outside with them the way a weather front brings its own atmosphere. The smell of engine heat and highway miles and the sweat produced by fast riding in July heat. They moved with the heavy, unhurried arrogance of men who had never had reason to question whether a room would receive them, because every room they'd ever entered had received them the same way, by immediately reorganizing itself around their presence. At the front was Steck. He was 42 years old and built like a coiled spring. Not large the way Vance was large, but dense and precise energy contained and pressurized. His face looked like it had been cut from granite by someone who believed in economy, the minimum necessary features arranged for durability rather than expression. His eyes were a pale, washed-out blue that contained nothing resembling warmth and a great deal resembling calculation. He wore his cut tight over a black t-shirt, a heavy steel-linked chain running from his belt loop to his wallet, the link swaying and catching the light as he walked. He was the vice president of the charter. He had been the vice president for 8 years, and in those 8 years, he had demonstrated a consistent, almost elegant ability to make problems disappear by the application of whatever degree of force was precisely necessary, and never more, because more attracted attention, and attracting attention was the one sin Steck considered genuinely unforgivable. Behind him came 3 prospects, younger men, heavy-bearded, wearing their cuts with the combination of pride and anxiety of men who had not yet earned the full weight of what they were wearing, who were still in the process of proving something. They carried gear bags and positioned themselves near the door with the instinctive spatial awareness of men who'd been trained to always know where the exits were. Steck stopped just inside the door. He let his eyes adjust from the afternoon glare to the bar's dimness. He scanned the room in a single systematic circuit. Whitlow at the bar, Briggs at his corner, the idle pool tables, the dark back booth, and then his pale eyes stopped. He found Vance, and he found the small, frightened girl sitting across from him. The room's silence reached a new depth. Not the ambient quiet of an empty afternoon, not the pressurized silence of a confrontation in progress, but something more structural. The silence of a fundamental shift in the composition of a space. The silence you hear in the moment before the first domino moves. Steck did not say hello. He unclipped his leather riding gloves from his hands in two precise, unhurried movements and slapped them against his thigh with a sound like a single clap. His pale eyes did not leave the back booth. "What in the hell is that, Vance?" His voice was smooth and quiet, carrying the long vowels of Deep South Georgia ancestry, each word coded in a slow deliberateness that made the absence of anger in his tone more unsettling than anger would have been. He did not point at Della. He looked at her the way you look at a structural problem clinically without malice calculating load and consequence. Vance pulled his pack of cigarettes from his cut pocket. He extracted one, struck a match, the sulfur flare bright in the dimness, and lit it. He drew a long breath of smoke and let it out slowly through his nose. He did not stand up. Standing up was theater. He had nothing to perform. "Stray," Vance said. Steck walked toward the back of the room. His boots struck the floorboards in a slow, measured cadence, the pace of a man who never walked faster than he intended to, who had learned that speed communicated urgency, and urgency communicated weakness. The three prospects moved from the door, spreading out near the pool tables in a loose semicircle that blocked the room's middle without being explicit about it. He stopped 3 feet from the booth and looked down at Della with the same flat clinical assessment. Della had pressed herself as far into the corner of the vinyl bench as the physical dimensions of the booth allowed. She was holding her breath. Her hands were clenched in her lap. Steck shifted his gaze to Vance. "We ain't an animal shelter, brother," he said. The word brother landed without warmth, a designation of category rather than affection. "Why is there a child in my clubhouse?" "Tweaker chased her in," Vance said. He flicked an ash into his cold coffee mug. "Name's Pruitt, strung out on glass. I told him to walk. He walked." Steck's eyes narrowed by a fraction of a degree. The only visible change in his face, but in a face that economical, it was significant. "A tweaker knows she's here," Steck said. "You brought heat to the door." "I didn't bring anything." The edge in Vance's voice broke through the indifference, for the first time a low, controlled fracture. He leaned forward slightly, pressing his forearms into the table. "She ran in. He followed. I handled it." "You handled it by keeping the evidence." Steck's voice remained smooth, the drawl thickening slightly the way it did when he was delivering something he wanted to land clearly. He turned his head and spat on the floor, a small, conclusive gesture. "Get her out of here. Now." Della made a sound, tiny and voluntary, barely audible. Her fingers found the edge of the table and gripped it, her knuckles going white. Vance looked at Steck. He looked at the cold, practical certainty in the younger man's pale eyes. He understood the logic. He had operated inside that logic for over 2 decades. A damaged child in a biker bar was not a moral problem within the framework of their world. It was an operational problem, a liability measured in police cruisers and federal attention and the expensive chaos of a raid. Steck was not wrong by the rules of the world they both lived in. But Vance also felt transmitted through the grain of the table under his forearms, the ghost of a small, cold hand on his shin. "No," Vance said. The single syllable dropped into the room, and the room received it the way it receives a stone dropped into still water, the immediate radiating consequence of impact. Whitlow's rag stopped. Briggs turned from his corner with the slow, deliberate rotation of a man who has been waiting for a specific moment and has recognized it. The three prospects near the pool table stiffened their hands, moving from their sides, in the instinctive preparation of men trained to read the room and respond to its sudden pressures. Refusing a direct order from the club's vice president on club property was not a small thing. It was not a thing you walk back from without consequence, regardless of which direction the confrontation went. Vance understood this with the complete unsentimental clarity of a man who had been inside this world long enough to know exactly what he was doing and what it would cost. Steck's head tilted by a degree. A cold, slow smile arrived at the corners of his mouth and stayed there without reaching his eyes. "Excuse me." Vance crushed his cigarette against the tabletop. He did it without looking away from Steck. He stood up. He did it slowly, not the explosive motion of a man going on offense, but the heavy, deliberate unfolding of a man who is done being seated, who has decided the geometry of the situation requires him to be vertical. He rose to his full height, and Steck had to adjust his gaze upward by 3 inches to maintain eye contact, and the adjustment, small as it was, communicated something that the younger man's jaw briefly registered before his discipline smoothed it away. "That tweaker is still out there," Vance said. His voice had dropped below its normal register, operating now at the frequency of something that had stopped being conversational. "Probably in the trees across the highway waiting for her to come out. I push her out that door, he gets her, beats her to death in a ditch somewhere off the 80, and leaves her for the coyotes." He paused. "That brings the county. That brings the state boys. That brings dogs running their noses along our property line." He held Steck's gaze. "She stays until I figure out a clean way to move her. That's not a request." Steck looked up at him for a long moment. The calculation behind his pale eyes was visible, the political algebra of a confrontation between the vice president of a charter and one of its most senior members on club property in front of witnesses on both sides. Vance could see the variables being processed. The weight Steck would lose from backing down. The weight he would lose from an open brawl with a man whom several key members of the club would have forced to choose, put their bodies on the side of. Steck looked at Briggs. Briggs stood still. He was not performing stillness. He simply was still the way a wall is still, not deciding to be immovable, but simply built that way. His arms hung at his sides. His face communicated nothing except his continued presence in the room, and his continued presence in the room communicated everything. Steck looked at Whitlow. Whitlow was polishing a glass. He held it up to the dim light and examined it for spots. He found none. He set it down and picked up another. The math resolved. Steck let out a short breath through his nose, the sound of a calculation being filed rather than surrendered to. His expression returned to the smooth, cold baseline. "Your mess," he said. He pointed one gloved finger at Vance's chest, a precise, deliberate gesture. "She makes a sound that carries. She breaks something. A unit even slow rolls past this building. It's your patch." He held the point for one beat. Then he lowered his hand, turned on his heel, and walked toward the pool tables, his boots hitting the floor in the same measured cadence they'd arrived in. "Whitlow," he said without turning. "Whiskey. Leave the bottle." The prospects fell in behind him, reorganizing the room's geography back toward ordinary. Vance exhaled. It came out of him in a long, slow deflation, the adrenaline crash arriving with its familiar inventory of after effects. Slight tremor in the hands, sourness in the stomach, a new depth to the headache behind his eye. He braced himself briefly against the edge of the table. He looked back at the booth. Della had curled into herself completely, face pressed into her knees, both hands covering her ears. Her shoulders were moving in the rhythm of quiet, broken crying, not loud, not hysterical, but the deep, exhausted sobs of a body that has nothing left but grief for its own situation. The kind of crying that has given up on anyone hearing it. Vance slumped back into the bench across from her. Every joint in his body registered its sustained objections to the afternoon in unison. He reached across the table. He moved his hand slowly, deliberately, the way you'd move your hand towards something that startles easily. He laid his heavy, scarred palm on top of her head, not pressing, not gripping, just resting. Barely contact. The weight of a hand finding the warmth of the top of her skull through the tangled, dirty hair. "He's gone," Vance said. His voice was rougher than he wanted it to be. It was the only voice he had. "Nobody's putting you out." Under his palm, the crying continued quieter, now moving from active sobs toward the ragged, diminishing aftershocks. Her small shoulders kept moving. Outside, the Nevada afternoon burned on above the roadhouse, indifferent as the desert always was to what happened in the structures built upon it. Vance sat in the back booth with his hand resting on a frightened child's head, and his cold coffee and his headache, and the full weight of a decision whose consequences had not yet begun to arrive. The afternoon bled toward evening. He didn't move. The roadhouse settled into its evening atmosphere around him, The gradual accumulation of voices and boots on floorboards and the low bass-heavy thump of music from the jukebox as Briggs finally fed at quarters and the room acquired the texture of a normal night. More members filtered in. The pool tables came alive with the clack of balls and low competitive profanity. The smell of spilled beer and cigarette smoke thickened in the air. The neon Coors sign out front buzzed and flickered as the power fluctuated in the heat. Della had stopped crying. She sat across from Vance in a state of complete exhaustion. Not sleep, but the condition just below sleep. The body's systems running at minimum to conserve what little was left. Her chin rested on her knees. Her eyes were open but unfocused, staring at the surface of the table without seeing it. The neon's red light fell across the left side of her face and made the bruise on her cheek look almost luminous, the colors deepening in the evening's dim warmth, the skin around it tighter now, more insistent. The other members moved around the back booth in a wide, instinctive arc. Nobody came to the back corner. Nobody asked questions. In a world built on the systematic avoidance of things that could be used against you, the universal response to the child in the back booth was to not have seen the child in the back booth. It was, Vance thought, the most functional form of decency available to the men in this room, and he didn't hold it against them that it was. At some point past 9, Vance got up and went behind the bar. Steck watched from the pool table, tracking him with his pale eyes but saying nothing. Vance took a clean white bar towel from the stack near the sink, went to the ice machine, and filled the center of the towel with a handful of crushed ice. He twisted the ends together and walked back to the booth. He sat down. He reached across the table with the ice pack. Della flinched hard when the cold touched her cheek, a sharp, full-body recoil, a hiss of air through her teeth. She tried to pull away. "Hold still," Vance said. Not harsh, but firm. The voice of a man who has decided something is going to happen and is simply communicating the decision. She went rigid, her breathing hitched, but she stopped pulling away. He held the ice pack against the swollen purple mass on her cheekbone. Cold water ran from the towel down the line of her jaw and dripped from her chin onto the surface of her shirt. His arm ached from the awkward angle across the table. He didn't move. "Going to keep the swelling down," he said quietly. "Otherwise, your eye will be shut by morning." They sat in that configuration for 5 minutes. The jukebox played a slow, heavy slide guitar. Men talked in low voices at the pool tables. The ice melted and the towel grew heavy and warm. Della did not pull away again. After a while, she began to speak in the quiet, flat voice of someone making a report, to no one in particular, just releasing information into the air, because the alternative was carrying it alone. She told him about the closet with no light in it. She told him how long she'd been inside before Pruitt passed out. She told him about pushing the window screen out with both hands and dropping into the dry Nevada dirt 3 feet below, and running without direction, just away, just out, just anywhere that wasn't the apartment, with the broken deadbolt and the chemical smell in Pruitt's boots on the linoleum. Vance listened. He did not comment. He did not offer reassurance. He held the ice pack against her face and listened. And the act of receiving the information without flinching from it, without redirecting it, without performing a response, seemed to be what she needed from him, because she kept talking in her quiet, careful voice until there was nothing left to say. When the ice was gone, he put the wet towel on the table. He looked at her cheek. The swelling had reduced slightly, the color slightly less livid. He looked at her face. "Nobody is going to touch you," he said. He said it the way he said things he had decided were true, without inflection, without the upward lilt of a reassurance or a promise. A statement of fact about a future that had already been determined. She looked at him across the sticky table. She read his face with her watchful gray eyes, running the same calculations she'd been running since she first looked up at him from under the table, searching for the crack in the certainty, the place where the reassurance ended and the contingency began. She didn't find one. Around 10:30, she was asleep. It happened without transition. One moment her eyes were open, and the next moment they were not, her body making the executive decision without consulting her. She folded into herself against the vinyl bench knees, pulled up face resting on the back of her own hand, her breathing finally settling into the deep, even rhythm of genuine sleep, rather than the shallow, anxious semi-consciousness she'd been in all evening. She looked younger asleep. Stripped of the hypervigilance, the constant perceptual labor, she was just a small child again. All the sharp, defensive angles softened. Just breath in the slow rise and fall of her thin shoulders. Vance sat across from her with his cold coffee and the remnants of a headache and the full accumulated weight of the day. Briggs materialized at the edge of the booth. He was holding 2 cups of coffee, and he set one down in front of Vance without being asked. He stood for a moment looking at the sleeping child. His massive arms crossed his face, doing the thing it always did, communicating more through its careful neutrality than most faces communicated through expression. "Can't leave her on the vinyl," Briggs said, low enough that it didn't carry. "Neck'll be wrecked when she wakes up." Vance looked at Della's awkward position on the bench. "Touch her, she'll wake up screaming," he said. Briggs was quiet for a moment. "Then let her scream," he said. "President's office is empty. Couch in there's better. Lock on the door." Vance looked at Briggs. It was a small thing, a logistical suggestion no more. But within the grammar of their world, it was something else as well. Briggs was not a man who offered solutions to problems he hadn't quietly decided to accept. He wasn't voting. He wasn't making a speech. He was doing what Briggs always did, which was to find the most functional path through the available terrain and point toward it, and then leave whatever happened next to the man responsible for it. Vance nodded once. He set down his coffee. He stood his joints protesting in their full evening register. He stood over Della for a moment, looking at her position on the bench, calculating the geometry of moving her without triggering the violent panicked waking he was certain would come. He reached down with both arms, one under her knees, one behind her shoulders, and lifted. She weighed nothing. The thought arrived before the sensation was fully registered, the absolute startling lightness of her. He had lifted engine blocks heavier than this child, but the lightness of her was not the lightness of something small and inert. It was the lightness of something fragile, the specific alarming ratio of something that could break. He pulled her against his chest. She did not scream. She did not thrash. She let out a soft, shuddering exhale, not distress, something closer to the opposite, and turned her face inward, pressing it against the heavy leather of his. Cut, her small fingers instinctively curling into the fabric of his shirt underneath, finding a grip on the material, the way you'd find a handhold in the dark. The trust of it, the unconscious, absolute, completely unguarded trust of it, hit him somewhere he had not been hit in a very long time. He stood still for a moment in the middle of the roadhouse with the sleeping child against his chest, and the jukebox playing its slow blues, and the men at the pool tables aggressively not watching him. And he felt the ache behind his sternum open up briefly into something with more dimension to it, something that had geography and history attached to it, before he closed it back down under the accumulated weight of 2 decades of practiced indifference. He carried her down the back hallway. The president's office was a windowless room that smelled of old cigars and gun oil and the staleness of paper that hadn't been moved in years. A battered metal desk, a filing cabinet, a sagging brown leather sofa that had seen decades of use and wore the evidence of it in every crease and sag. Vance set Della down on the sofa. He pulled the worn gray wool blanket from the back of the desk chair and draped it over her. She curled into herself beneath it, fingers relaxing out of their grip on his shirt, her breathing continuing its deep, steady rhythm without interruption. He stood there for a moment. Then he reached into his cut pocket and took out the heavy brass key to the office door. He looked at it in his hand. He set it on the desk. He left the door unlocked. He was not going to be another deadbolt holding her captive in a dark room. When he stepped back into the hallway, Steck was leaning against the wall with a cigarette, the cherry casting its dim orange light on the hard angles of his face. The two men looked at each other in the hallway's narrow quiet. "Your mess," Steck said again. Quiet, not cruel, the final accounting. "I know what it is," Vance said. Steck took a long drag. blew it toward the ceiling. "Clock's running," he said. 72 hours. That's what I told the boys. After that, it goes to the table." He dropped the cigarette on the wooden floor and crushed it under his boot heel and walked back toward the bar without waiting for a response. Vance stood in the hallway. Through the closed office door, no sound. Just the slow, regular breathing of a child in the first deep sleep she had probably managed in a very long time. He stood there until the sound of the bar reasserted itself around him. Boots and voices and pool cues and the jukebox churning into its next song. Then he pulled out his own cigarettes, went to the back door, and stepped out into the Nevada night. The air outside was cold and sharp after the stale heat of the bar, carrying the smell of sage and dry pine and the distant metal ghost of the interstate. A half moon had risen above the dark line of the mountains to the east, casting the property in pale gray light that made the scattered, rusted machinery and dead bikes in the lot look like the bones of something long extinct. Vance lit his cigarette. He stood on the back loading dock and let the cold air hit the sweat on the back of his neck, and he began doing what his instincts had been pressing him to do since the moment Pruitt had walked out the front door. He had sent Pruitt running. He had put genuine visible terror into the man. He knew how to do this, had done it 1,000 times, could calibrate it with precision. But terror was a fuel. It burned hot and it burned fast. And when it burned off, it left behind either compliance or desperation. And in men like Pruitt, men already running on the chaotic chemistry of stimulant abuse and wounded pride, in the paranoid logic of addiction, it burned off fast and left behind desperation almost every time. Pruitt knew where Della was. Vance stepped down off the loading dock and began walking the perimeter. He moved along the back of the building, his boots quiet on the gravel, his eyes adjusting to the dark beyond the loading dock light. He walked the back fence line where the property edged the tree line. He walked the south side of the building. He came around toward the front parking lot, moving through the deeper shadow where the building met the gravel. That was when he smelled it. Not a sound, not movement. A smell that didn't belong to the night's natural inventory. A synthetic sweetness layered over the sharp sulfur of burnt chemicals. The metabolic signature of a body running hard on meth. Vape juice and chemical sweat, and the particular combination of them that Vance had learned over years of proximity to recognize the way you learn to recognize weather. He stopped. He stood in the deep shadow against the wall of the building and did not move and did not make a sound. 30 seconds. A silhouette detached itself from the darkness at the edge of the tree line near the dumpsters, smaller than the threat he'd been imagining the way threats always were when you finally saw them in the dark. Pacing, muttering to himself in a voice too low to carry, a tire iron swinging loose at his right side, in the absent, habitual way of a man who had forgotten he was holding it. Pruitt. He was staring at the dark windows of the roadhouse, trying to work up the nerve to do something that the part of his brain still connected to self-preservation was loudly advising against. He was not generating the nerve to leave. He was generating the nerve to go back in. Vance did not announce himself. Announcements were for situations that allowed for negotiation. This situation had already been negotiated. This situation had been fully explicitly resolved approximately 4 hours ago when Pruitt had been told to walk and had walked, and the fact that Pruitt had come back meant the resolution had not held, and the fact that it had not held meant there was only one remaining resolution available, and that resolution did not require conversation. He moved off the wall, 3 strides fast and silent across the pale gravel of the lot. Pruitt's head was still turned away, still focused on the dark windows of the roadhouse, and he heard nothing until the final moment when the displacement of air against the back of his neck triggered the survival instinct a half-second too late. He spun. His arm was already coming up with the tire iron in the blind, panicked arc of a man who had no time to aim, only to swing. Vance stepped inside the arc. He took the swing on his left forearm, felt the impact, acknowledged it, filed it away for later, and simultaneously drove his right hand forward, thumb and fingers, wrapping entirely around Pruitt's throat, closing on the column of muscle and cartilage, with the grip of a man who has spent 5 decades working with his hands. The momentum of the move carried them both backward. Vance planted his feet and drove through, using his mass the way a wall uses mass, not by moving, but by being immovable in the path of a moving thing. Pruitt hit the corrugated steel side of the dumpster. The sound was a hollow, resonant boom that rolled out across the empty lot and echoed off the building's wall and dissolved into the dark Nevada sky. The tire iron clattered to the asphalt. Pruitt's hands flew up, fingers scrabbling at the massive forearm across his throat, nails dragging uselessly against the scarred leather-hard skin. His eyes were fully blown black discs in white fields, reflecting the pale moonlight in twin points of terrified phosphorescence. His feet were moving against the pavement, trying to find purchase, finding none. Vance held him against the dumpster and leaned in until the distance between them was the distance of a whisper. "You've got a terrible memory," Vance said. His voice was barely above a breath. No volume to it. Scraping gravel. Pruitt made a wet gagging sound. His hands kept working at Vance's forearm, the grip spastic and purposeless. Vance eased the pressure by a fraction, enough for a thin sliver of air to pass. Pruitt sucked it in with a desperate wheezing whine. "I told you to walk," Vance said. "You walked. Now you're back." He tilted his head slightly. "She's not yours." "You can't," Pruitt gagged, spit flying. "You can't just—" Vance's grip tightened again. Pruitt's jaw snapped shut. "I told you what I'd do." Vance's voice dropped further into the frequency that existed below threat and above fact. "I want you to think about that very carefully right now. I want you to think about whether the thing you came here to do is worth what happens after it." He held Pruitt against the dumpster and let the silence do the work that words didn't need to do. 10 seconds. 20. Pruitt's hands had stopped scrabbling. His legs had stopped moving. The only motion left in him was the involuntary flutter of his eyelids and the desperate rhythmic hammering of his pulse against Vance's palm. Vance released his grip and stepped back in a single simultaneous motion, opening space between them, removing himself from the equation before Pruitt's body had fully processed the change. Pruitt collapsed off the dumpster onto the asphalt in a heap of disorganized limbs, coughing violently, both hands flying to his own throat, his lungs pulling air in the ragged, desperate gasps of something that has just been reminded it needs oxygen to survive. He retched onto his own hands. He got one knee under him, then the other. He did not reach for the tire iron. He did not look up at Vance. He gathered himself with the lurching, uncoordinated urgency of a man operating on pure survival reflex and scrambled toward the tree line. He disappeared into the pines. Vance listened to the sound of crashing brush and snapping twigs diminishing into the trees, growing fainter, moving east away from the building. He stood in the empty parking lot in the thin moonlight. He bent down and picked up the tire iron from the asphalt. He tested the weight of it in his hand, cold steel, heavy, functional. Then he tossed it into the open top of the dumpster. It landed among the bottles and debris with a hollow metallic clang. He stood there. His left forearm ached where the tire iron had connected. He'd feel it properly in the morning. He pulled out his cigarettes. His hands were not entirely steady, the adrenaline still working through his system, and lit one, cupping the match in his palm against the night air. The immediate threat was gone. The perimeter was for tonight secure. But as he stood in the dark lot and smoked his cigarette and listened to the highway and the crickets and the muffled bass from the jukebox inside the building behind him, the larger arithmetic assembled itself with the patient clarity that always came to him in the aftermath of action when the noise cleared and the numbers appeared. Pruitt would not come back tonight. He was broken, genuinely, physically, chemically broken by the encounter, his nervous system too overloaded to process another direct confrontation in the span of a few hours. But broken was not permanent. Broken men reassembled themselves slowly in the particular broken shape of the thing they were most driven by. And Pruitt was driven by the small, specific desperation of an addict who needed to recover what he'd lost, not because he cared about a child, but because the child was leverage he'd wielded with impunity for long enough that its absence was its own kind of emergency. And there was the club, and the 72 hours Steck had put on the clock, and the county deputy who would eventually widen his search radius, and the mother somewhere who existed as a fact in Della's life, even if she'd been absent from the roadhouse's doors. All of these things were coming. Vance finished his cigarette. He crushed it under the toe of his boot and stood in the dark for another moment, looking at the roadhouse, its dark, weathered profile against the lighter dark of the Nevada sky, the thin red glow of the neon sign visible through the front windows, the low bass thump of the music just audible above the crickets. He had a child sleeping on the president's couch. He had 72 hours. He had no plan. He recognized standing in that parking lot with the smell of the desert and the distant interstate washing over him, that the last time he had looked at a child and felt this particular weight, this cold, unavoidable sense of being the only thing standing between a small person and the worst available outcome, had been 20 years ago. The memory of it was not a memory he visited willingly. It lived in the closed room with everything else he had put there and left. He turned and walked back inside. Morning came to the Nevada high desert the way it always did in July, without apology and without transition, the darkness simply replaced by a white, scorching glare that turned the roadhouse's dirty windows into rectangles of raw light and made the dust motes hanging in the air visible as a slow, permanent constellation. Vance had not slept. He had lain on the storage room cot for 4 hours, staring at the water-stained ceiling tiles, running the arithmetic of the situation through his mind, the way an engine runs rough when one cylinder isn't firing the same sequence, the same problem arriving at the same incomplete answer every time it cycled through. The cot was too short for his frame, and the mattress was too thin for his back, and the arithmetic was too complicated for the 4 ibuprofen he'd taken at midnight, which had done nothing for the headache and less for the dull, grinding awareness of what the next 72 hours contained. At 5:30, he gave up on sleep entirely, pulled on his boots without lacing them, and walked out to the main room. Whitlow was already behind the bar. This was not surprising. In 19 years of drinking at this establishment, Vance had never arrived to find Whitlow absent. He sometimes suspected Whitlow didn't leave, that the man simply dimmed somewhere behind the bar when the last customer was gone, and brightened again when the first one arrived, like the neon sign. He had never asked. It seemed like the kind of question Whitlow would answer with silence, and the silence would be more unsettling than ignorance. The flat-top griddle was already hot, the smell of rendered bacon fat filling the room with a thick, greasy warmth that cut through the stale overnight air. Whitlow moved behind the bar with his characteristic economy cracking eggs against the edge of the griddle, with single, precise motions, not looking up, not acknowledging Vance's arrival, except by the slight adjustment of his posture that communicated awareness. Vance sat in his booth. The room was quiet in the way of a space that contained several sleeping men who were not yet awake. 3 members had crashed on pushed-together chairs. One of the prospects was folded over the pool table with his cut as a pillow, his snoring providing an irregular baseline to the morning silence. Briggs was nowhere visible, which meant he was either in the back or had left in the night. And with Briggs, either was equally probable, and neither required investigation. Vance wrapped his hands around a mug of coffee Whitlow had placed in front of him without being asked. The ceramic was hot enough to ache against his arthritic knuckles. He let it ache. The pain was useful. It occupied a portion of his attention and left the rest free to work the problem. He was staring at the surface of the coffee when the sound came. It was small, almost nothing. The soft click of a door latch releasing, followed by the near silent friction of a door moving over a floorboard that didn't quite clear the wood. Sounds so small that in a room with more noise they would have been completely invisible. In the morning quiet of the roadhouse, they arrived like a signal. Vance looked up. Della stood at the edge of the hallway. She had the gray wool blanket pulled around her shoulders, with both hands clutched at her sternum in a grip that kept it in place while leaving her arms slightly wrapped around herself, a posture that managed to communicate both the holding of warmth and the holding of herself together. Her feet were bare on the floorboards. Her hair had been partially smoothed by sleep into something less chaotic than last night, though it was still matted at the back where she'd been lying on it. The bruise on her left cheek had done what bruises do. Overnight deepened and spread the purple at its center, now a dark, almost black concentration. The surrounding tissue puffed and discolored in a wide radius. Her left eye was partially swollen, the lid thickened and heavy, reducing her field of vision on that side. She stood at the edge of the hallway and did not move. Her one fully open eye did its circuit of the room methodical quick. The practiced scan of someone for whom reading a room was not a social skill, but a survival skill. She clocked the sleeping members. She clocked the prospect at the pool table. She found Whitlow behind the bar. He was looking at the griddle, and she held on him for a moment, assessing. Then she found Vance in the back booth. He didn't stand up. He didn't call to her or gesture or do anything that would require a response before she was ready to give one. He simply sat with his coffee in his aching hands and met her eye across the length of the room, and he offered her the same thing he'd offered her from under the table yesterday, his stillness, his solidity, the fact of his continued presence in the space without agenda or urgency. He gave her a single slow nod. She looked at the door to the outside. He could see her run the calculation, the familiar inventory of exits, the brief habitual assessment of what was outside them and whether outside was safer than inside. The arithmetic a child in her situation ran so automatically it had probably stopped feeling like a decision and started feeling like breathing. She looked back at Vance. Then she stepped away from the wall. She moved along the room's perimeter, keeping the maximum available distance between herself and the sleeping men, her bare feet making no sound on the old pine. She passed the end of the bar without looking at Whitlow, and Whitlow, to his considerable credit, did not look at her, either, maintaining his absolute focus on the griddle with the commitment of a man who had decided this particular morning contained only bacon and eggs and no other information whatsoever. She reached the booth. She stood beside it for a moment, looking at the vinyl bench. Then she put both hands on the edge of the seat, hoisted herself up with the slightly effortful motion of someone whose limbs were still working out the stiffness of an unusual night's sleep, and settled into the corner with her knees pulled up and the blanket arranged around her. She sat across from Vance. Vance looked at her bruised face, at the controlled, deliberate stillness that was not the stillness of peace, but of a child who had learned that stillness was the safest available posture in uncertain environments. He said, "He's gone." He said it simply, without preamble, without building toward it. She deserved the information first before anything else. Della looked at him. Her pale gray eye, the one that could fully open, did the thing it had been doing since yesterday, the deep calibrated read searching his face for the place where the certainty ended. "Pruitt," Vance said. "He came back last night. I had a conversation with him." He held her gaze. "He won't be back." The way he said the last four words contained everything he needed to communicate and nothing he needed to explain. The tone of it was not threat and not boast. It was the flat declarative of a man reporting a completed action. He had been this kind of man for 30 years, and the certainty in it was not performed. She watched his face for 3 full seconds. Then the tension in her shoulders, a tension so habitual, she probably no longer felt it as tension, just as the normal condition of her body released by a fraction of a degree. Not gone. Diminished. The difference between a fist clenched at full force and a fist clenched at 3/4. She exhaled. A long, slow breath that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than her lungs. "Okay," she whispered. Whitlow appeared at the edge of the booth. He set down a heavy white plate without ceremony, 2 fried eggs with intact yolks, 3 strips of bacon charred to the Roadhouse's invariable standard, 2 pieces of white toast running with butter. Beside the plate, a small glass of orange juice poured from a carton that Vance suspected had been purchased specifically this morning because he had never in 19 years seen orange juice behind Whitlow's bar before. Whitlow set down the plate and the juice and turned and walked away. Della looked at the food. She looked at it the way she had looked at the bread and peanut butter yesterday. The immediate, absolute focus of someone for whom food was not an assumption, But there was a difference in the quality of it this morning. Yesterday's hunger had been feral. Today's was simply hunger. She picked up the fork, picking it up rather than grabbing at a small but real distinction, and took a careful bite of the egg. The yolk broke. Yellow ran across the white of the plate. She chewed slowly, her eyes closed briefly. Not in performance, in the involuntary, honest response of a body receiving something it needed. Vance drank his coffee and watched her eat and did not speak while she was doing it, because she needed to eat without the cognitive load of responding to him, and because he had nothing to say yet that was ready to be said. She worked through the eggs. She tore a strip of bacon in half and ate each half deliberately. She used the toast to collect the yolk from the plate in the careful, thorough way of someone who had been taught by experience rather than instruction not to leave anything. When the plate was clean, she set the fork down and looked at him. "Thank you," she said. The two words were simple and direct, and completely without the performance of gratitude, not the anxious people-pleasing thank you of a child trained to offer it as a deflection, but the clean, honest acknowledgement of someone who meant it precisely as much as it contained, and not more. Vance nodded once. Then Briggs materialized at the end of the booth. He was carrying his own coffee, already dressed, no indication of whether he'd slept or where. He looked at Della, a brief, neutral assessment, not unfriendly, simply informational, and then at Vance. "Need to talk," Briggs said. Vance looked at Della. She had registered Briggs's arrival with a slight tightening of her grip on the edge of the blanket, but had not retreated a small thing, but Vance noted it. 14 hours in this place had not made her comfortable, but it had moved her incrementally away from the acute terror of yesterday afternoon. "Stay here," Vance told her. "Don't leave the booth." She nodded, pulling her orange juice toward her, wrapping both hands around the glass. Vance slid out of the booth and followed Briggs to the far end of the bar, where the counter curved and the light was dim and the nearest sleeping member was 20 feet away. Briggs set his coffee down. He looked at Vance with the direct, unornamented gaze of a man who considered it a waste of both their time to build up to something. "Steck made a call last night," Briggs said. Vance was still. "After you went outside," Briggs continued, his voice at the low, flat register that carried no further than the two of them. "Called Crandall. Deputy Crandall. The county's long presence on this stretch of highway, not aggressive, not ambitious, just consistent. A man who did his job with the patient, methodical attention of someone who understood that his job in this particular geography was largely about patience and very little about speed. He didn't report anything," Briggs said. "Didn't call in a missing child. Just made contact. Let it be known there was something worth knowing about in the area of the roadhouse." Briggs picked up his coffee, took a drink, set it down. "Steck doesn't need to pull the trigger himself. He just needs to make sure the gun is pointed in the right direction." Vance absorbed this. It was, he acknowledged internally, a sophisticated move. A direct confrontation with Vance inside the club, especially after last night, after the room had done its implicit arithmetic and the vote had landed where it landed, was costly. But an external resolution required no internal cost at all. If the county came for the child was gone, and Steck had done nothing that could be held against him within the club's own accounting. "How do you know?" Vance asked. "Because Steck used the bar phone and I was in the back hallway," Briggs said. No elaboration, no apology for the fact of having been there. Vance looked at the far wall of the bar, at the old dartboard hanging there, its surface pocked with years of imprecise throws. He had 72 hours on Steck's clock. He had less than that before Crandall made his move. Crandall would be methodical about it, would not want to spook anything before he had enough to act on, but he would start his approach today. By afternoon, probably. A slow roll past the property, a reason to stop. The clock had been running since 2 yesterday afternoon. It was now 6 in the morning. "All right," Vance said. Briggs picked up his coffee. The conversation was complete as far as Briggs was concerned. He had delivered the information. What happened with it was not his responsibility, and he had not volunteered for it to become his responsibility, and Vance understood this and respected it, and did not ask for more than had been offered. He walked back to the booth. Della had finished her orange juice. She was sitting with both hands in her lap, watching the room in the quiet, alert way she'd been watching it since she'd arrived, the constant low-level attentiveness of someone who processed their environment as continuously and automatically as breathing. Vance sat down. He worked the problem the way he'd always worked problems in the open in plain sight, letting it run through the machinery of a mind built over 50 years to process exactly this kind of unresolvable weight. Not calls, not paper, just the grinding of variables against each other until one of them gave. He could not call child services. He could not go to the police, not simply because the law was not a thing he trusted, but because the law in this specific situation led directly back to Nadine Foss. And Nadine Foss led back to Pruitt, and the system that was supposed to protect children from men like Pruitt had, by all available evidence, not been doing that. He could not put Della back. He had understood this since yesterday afternoon in the booth when she'd whispered about the closet and the window and the bicycle her grandmother had given her. He had understood it with the same cold, complete clarity with which he understood mechanical problems. When a component is failing, you don't reinstall it and hope it holds. You remove it and find something better. The problem was the something better. He didn't talk to her about what Briggs had told him. She was 7 years old, and she had enough weight on her already. Instead, he watched her. He watched the way she tracked movement in the room, registering each member who woke each time the front door opened, each shift in the room's ambient noise level. He watched the way she positioned herself in the booth, always with her back to the wall, always with a clear line of sight to the exit. She had been trained by her life to survive in environments like this one. She didn't know the vocabulary for what she was doing, but she was doing it with the competence of someone who had been doing it for a long time. "Hey," Vance said. She looked at him. "You know how to be quiet in the dark." She looked at him steadily. "Yes," she said. "You know what sounds mean something's wrong and what sounds are just noise." A pause, then carefully, "Some of them." "I'm going to teach you the rest," Vance said. "The sounds in this building, which ones matter and which ones don't." He held her gaze. "You stay in the back. You stay out of sight of the windows. Anyone comes through that front door that you don't recognize, you go straight to the office and you close the door. You understand?" Della nodded. It was not the nod of a child agreeing to a rule. It was the nod of someone receiving operational information and confirming receipt. "Good," Vance said. He spent the next hour teaching her the building's acoustic geography, the specific creak of the third floorboard from the back hallway door, which meant someone was coming from the office corridor. The difference between the sound of the front door opening under its own weight and the sound of it being pushed. The distinctive mechanical complaint of the side window in the men's room that was the building's only unmonitored point of ingress. He taught her the way you taught someone to read a map, not by explaining the theory of cartography, but by walking the territory and naming each landmark as it appeared. She absorbed it with an attention that was almost unnerving in its completeness. She did not ask him why. She understood at a level below language that this information was the kind that kept you alive, and she wanted to be alive, and so she listened with her entire body. By mid-morning, she knew the building sounds better than most of the men sleeping in it. They were in the booth when Vance heard the vehicle. He heard it before it was visible, the sound of a county-issue engine running at low speed on a gravel approach, the restraint of a vehicle that is not trying to arrive unheard, but is not trying to announce itself either. The sound of official movement conducted at the pace of procedure rather than urgency. Vance said quietly and immediately, "Office now." Della was off the bench and moving before the sentence was complete. He watched her cross the floor in the rapid, low-profile motion he'd seen yesterday, fast close to the walls, not running, but not walking, and disappear into the back hallway. The office door clicked shut a moment later. Vance turned back to his coffee. Deputy Crandall's cruiser pulled into the lot and stopped. Through the roadhouse's dirty front windows, Vance could see the shape of it, white and tan, the county seal on the door. No lights, no sirens, just the vehicle sitting in the lot with its engine running for 30 seconds before the engine stopped. The front door opened. Crandall was 53 years old, built with the slightly softened bulk of a man who had been physically capable in his 30s and had maintained enough of it to remain credible. He had a face designed for patience, broad, undemonstrative, the features arranged in a permanent expression of mild, attentive neutrality that gave away nothing about what he was thinking and everything about the fact that he was thinking it. He wore his uniform with the matter-of-fact ease of someone who had stopped noticing it long ago. He came through the door without drama, let it close behind him, looked around the room, 3 members at the bar eating, Briggs at his corner, Whitlow behind the bar, whose expression underwent no change whatsoever at the deputy's entrance, a reaction so perfectly calibrated to nothing that it was itself a kind of communication. Crandall's eyes found Vance in the back booth. He walked over. He stopped at the end of the booth and stood with his hands loose at his sides, his weight easy on both feet. Not aggressive, not performing authority, just present in the way of someone who has enough of it that performing it would be redundant. "Morning," Crandall said. "Deputy," Vance said. "Mind if I sit down?" "You're going to regardless," Vance said. "Might as well be comfortable." The corner of Crandall's mouth moved slightly. He sat down on the bench across from Vance and folded his hands on the tabletop. He looked around the booth unhurried. "Get you some coffee?" Vance asked. "I'm fine," Crandall said. He looked at the 2 coffee mugs on the table Vance's and the one across from him that still held a small amount of orange juice that Della hadn't finished. His eyes rested on the orange juice for one beat and moved on. "There's a missing persons report out of Elko," Crandall said. 7-year-old girl reported missing approximately 16 hours ago by a woman named Nadine Foss. Goes by Della." He looked at Vance. "Report came in from Elko PD. They're working the apartment end. I'm running the surrounding radius." Vance held his gaze. "Haven't seen a 7-year-old girl," Vance said. The same flat, level voice he'd used on Pruitt yesterday. Not aggressive, not defensive, simply a statement from a man who considered himself to have been asked a question and had answered it. Crandall nodded slowly in the manner of a man receiving information he will process later at his own pace. "Elko PD also received a call last night," Crandall said, "from a male individual who declined to identify himself, stating that a child matching this description had been seen in the vicinity of a roadhouse on Old 40. He paused. This being the only roadhouse on Old 40 within the relevant radius. "Lots of anonymous calls," Vance said. "Most of them don't mean anything." "Most of them," Crandall agreed. Silence settled between them. The silence of 2 men who understood each other well enough to not bother with performances neither of them would find convincing. Crandall unfolded one hand and laid it flat on the tabletop. "I'm going to ask you a direct question," he said. "You don't have to answer it, but I'm going to ask it because that's my job, and I think you know what my job is worth, even if we don't always agree on the methodology." Vance said nothing. "Is the child safe?" Crandall asked. The question landed in the booth with the precision of something that had been carried carefully and set down exactly where it was intended. Vance looked at Crandall. He looked at the deputy's face, the steady, patient eyes, the complete absence of the adversarial posturing that characterized most law enforcement interactions in Vance's experience. The question had been stripped of everything except itself. Not a legal maneuver, not a trap, just the question. "Yes," Vance said. Crandall held his gaze for a long moment. Then he nodded again, the same slow processing nod. "There's also a report," Crandall said more quietly, "filed this morning in Elko by the same woman, Nadine Foss. Assault against a man named Travis Pruitt." He watched Vance's face. "Pruitt was found this morning at a gas station on 93 in a condition consistent with a significant physical altercation. He told the attending officer he was jumped by unknown individuals in a parking lot. The officer noted that the details of his account were somewhat inconsistent. Vance did not confirm and did not deny and did not adjust his expression by a single measurable degree. Crandall breathed in slowly through his nose. He looked at the tabletop. He looked at the orange juice in the other mug. He looked at the faint impressions in the vinyl across from Vance, the slight compression of the cracked upholstery where a small person had been sitting for a while. He picked up his hat from where he'd set it on the seat beside him. He stood. "You've got my number," he said. He reached into his breast pocket and produced a card, plain white county seal, and set it on the table. "In case your memory improves." He walked toward the door, unhurried the way he'd come in. At the door, he paused without turning. "Situation like this," he said. "The clock doesn't stop because people aren't watching it. Whatever you're working on, work on it faster." Then he went through the door, and the morning light swallowed him, and the door swung shut. The room was quiet. Whitlow wiped the bar. Briggs turned back to his corner. Vance looked at the deputy's card on the table. He looked at it for a long time. Then he picked it up, folded it once, and put it in the pocket of his cut. He went to the back hallway and knocked on the office door. 2 knocks measured, not urgent. "It's Vance," he said. A pause. Then the latch turned and the door opened a crack, and Della looked at him through the gap, her gray eye making its assessment. "He's gone," Vance said. "Come on out." She came out of the office holding the blanket around herself. She looked up at him in the hallway's dimness. "Was that the police?" she asked. "Yes," he said. There was no point in lying to her. She'd processed enough reality to handle the truth of it. She absorbed this. "Are they going to take me?" she asked. "Not today," Vance said. She looked at him. "I'm working on it," he said. "I need you to trust me for a little longer." She thought about this with the serious, unhurried deliberation that she brought to every calculation she ran. Then she nodded and walked past him back toward the booth. He stood in the hallway for a moment. Working on it was at this point aspirational. Della spent the afternoon in the booth across from him, quiet, attentive, occasionally watching the room and occasionally looking at nothing in particular with the faraway expression of a child whose mind was working on its own problems in its own language. Once in the mid-afternoon, she fell asleep sitting up her head, dropping forward until her chin rested on her knees, and Vance sat across from her and did not move and did not speak, and let her sleep for 40 minutes until the noise from the pool tables woke her. She didn't startle awake. She just opened her eye and looked at the room and at him and was already present, already reading, already calibrating before she'd fully cleared sleep. She was the most vigilant child he had ever seen. He found it simultaneously impressive and quietly devastating. At some point in the mid-afternoon, while Della was tracing the routes on an old Nevada road map that Vance had found in the glove box of his bike, and given her mostly as something to keep her hands busy, Vance found himself watching her finger move along the interstate lines, following them from city to city, state to state, the lines that connected places to other places. He thought about distance, about what it meant to be far enough from something that it couldn't reach you anymore. He thought about a phone number he had not dialed in 22 years. It was late afternoon, the light going amber outside the dirty windows, when the situation's second complication arrived. She came through the front door without slamming it. She came through it slowly, one hand on the frame, the way you come through a door when you're not sure what's on the other side, and you've spent long enough getting to it that you're running on fumes by the time you arrive. She stood in the doorway and blinked against the bar's dimness and looked around the room with eyes that were red-rimmed and swollen from extended crying, the skin beneath them puffy and dark. She was perhaps 30 years old. She was thin in a way that was not healthy, her collarbones prominent above the neckline of a faded blue t-shirt, her wrists angular below the cuffs of a flannel she was wearing despite the heat. Her hair was light brown and pulled back in a loose, imprecise knot. She had Della's nose and Della's pale coloring, and she looked like someone who in better circumstances would be recognizably pretty, and who in current circumstances looked like someone who had been through something that was going to take a long time to process. Nadine Foss. Vance saw her before Della did. He looked at her and made his assessment quick, involuntary, the reading of a person's condition and intent that 30 years of living among dangerous people had made automatic. She was not with Pruitt. She was carrying no visible aggression. She was alone and exhausted and scared in the way of someone who had been scared for a long time and was running out of the energy required to keep being scared. He looked at Della. Della was looking at the room, and then she followed Vance's eyes the way people follow another person's gaze without deciding to the involuntary tracking of attention. She saw her mother. Something happened in Della's face that was not one thing. It was too complicated to be one thing. There was recognition, immediate, reflexive. There was something that might have been longing or might have been the memory of longing, the ghost of a need that had been present long enough to leave an impression even after hope had abandoned it. And there was something else colder and more recent, a wariness, a careful protective distance that Della placed between herself and the feeling the moment she felt it, the way you place your hand over a wound to keep it from getting worse. She did not move toward her mother. She looked at her mother through the bar's dim light from the safety of the back booth, and she did not stand up, and she did not call out, and she did not reach across the space between them. Then she looked at Vance, and she shook her head. It was a small motion, barely a motion at all. Just a slight, deliberate side-to-side movement of her head, her gray eyes steady on his face. It was the most complete answer to the most complete question he had ever received in a gesture that small. Vance exhaled through his nose. He slid out of the booth and walked toward the front of the bar. Behind him, he heard the quiet sound of Della pulling her feet up onto the bench and making herself small. He reached Nadine before any of the other members had registered her arrival with enough interest to act on it. He positioned himself between her and the room, not threatening, just present, his size alone, creating the boundary. "Outside," he said. She looked up at him all the way up, taking in the full height and breadth of him, the cut, the patches, the face that didn't offer anything she was going to find comforting. Her eyes showed a brief flash of instinctive fear, then something more complicated, the recognition that he was not what she'd expected to find here, and the desperate, exhausted search for what that meant. She went outside. He followed her out through the front door into the late afternoon heat. The parking lot was half in shadow, the roadhouse's profile cutting a hard line across the ground. Nadine stopped near the edge of the lot and turned to face him, hugging herself with both arms. Vance stood with his arms at his sides and looked at her. He let the silence run for a moment, not as a tactic, but because he was still forming the question. The right question, not one of the many wrong ones that would generate defensiveness, or the complicated, self-justifying narratives of people trying to explain how they got somewhere they knew they shouldn't be. "The bruise on her face," Vance said. "The one that's more than a day old. When did that happen?" Nadine's arms tightened around herself. She didn't answer. In the silence, a truck on the interstate changed gears. The sage flats spread out pale and dry and indifferent on every side of them. Vance looked at this woman, at the exhausted, depleted creature standing in front of him, worn down by whatever combination of circumstances and choices had produced this afternoon in this parking lot. And he understood something about her that he did not have a word for and did not need one. He had seen it before. Not often, but he had seen it, the devastating tiredness of someone who had known something was wrong and had chosen again and again in each specific moment of choosing to find a way to not fully know it. Not malice, not indifference. The much more human failure of someone who had looked at an unbearable thing and found that looking away was easier and had kept looking away until looking away had become the only thing they knew how to do. "She's not going back with him," Vance said. Nadine's eyes came back to his face. She was holding herself very still now, the way people go still when something has arrived that they've been partially expecting and are still not ready for. "She's not going back with him," Vance said again. Not louder, not harder. The same flat, absolute certainty. "That part's done. The only question left is what happens next." Nadine's face worked through something complicated and private. She looked at the ground. She looked at the roadhouse. She looked at her own hands. "I didn't know she started. "Don't," Vance said. Not unkind, just direct. She stopped. A tear moved down her left cheek. She did not wipe it away. She stood in the parking lot in the late Nevada afternoon and let it move and did not offer anything else. Vance looked at her for a long moment. I'm working on a solution, he said. I need a couple of days. When I have it, I'll be in touch. He paused. You don't go to Pruitt. You don't tell him anything. You don't give anyone in Elko any information about where she is. Can you do that? Nadine looked at him. Her voice when it came was very quiet. Is she okay? She asked. He held her gaze. She ate breakfast this morning, he said. She ate everything on the plate. Nadine closed her eyes briefly. The thing that moved across her face when she did was too private and too complicated to name. Okay, she said. She turned and walked to a rusted-out Civic at the far edge of the lot. She got in without looking back. The engine turned over after 2 attempts, and she pulled out onto Old 40 heading east, and the sound of her engine faded into the sound of the highway. Vance stood in the empty lot. The outline of a solution was beginning to form in his mind, incomplete, rough edge, dependent on a variable he hadn't tested in 22 years. He turned it over the way you turn over an engine component you found in a box of old parts, examining it for cracks, testing its weight, trying to determine whether it would hold the load or fail under it. He walked back inside. The evening assembled itself the way evenings at the roadhouse always did, the gradual accumulation of bodies and noise, and the comfortable brutality of men who understood each other's silences better than most people understood each other's words. The jukebox woke up and started bleeding classic rock into the thickening air. The pool table became loud. The bar became louder. Vance sat in the back booth and watched Della work on the road map, tracing the interstate roads with one careful finger. She followed them from city to city, state to state, the lines connecting places she had never been. It was past 9 when Steck came to the booth. He came alone. He sat down across from Vance. Della had gone to the office 20 minutes ago and folded his hands on the table and looked at Vance with his pale, calculating eyes. 22 hours left on the clock, Steck said. His southern drawl was lighter tonight. This was Steck without the performance of authority, Steck as a man rather than a vice president. After that, I called the table. I know, Vance said. I want to tell you something, Steck said. Not as VP, just as someone who's known you a long time. Vance held his gaze. You're not built for this, Steck said. The words landed without cruelty, with the careful, considered directness of something he'd been working up to saying. You're built for a lot of things. Hard things. I've seen you handle things that would break most men without breaking a sweat. He paused. But this is going to break you, Vance. One way or another, you keep her, the club tears apart. You give her to the county, she ends up back where she started in 6 months. Either way, you lose. Vance looked at him. You done, Vance said. Steck held his gaze for a moment. Then he nodded once and slid out of the booth and walked back toward the pool tables. Vance sat with the cold remnants of his coffee. Steck was not wrong. He was running an accurate analysis of the available outcomes from the available information. He just didn't have all the information. Vance reached into the pocket of his cut and pulled out the burner phone. He held it in his scarred hands and looked at it and thought about the last time he had used it and how long ago that had been. He thought about a phone number he had carried in his memory for 22 years, like a stone in a pocket present, always its weight, always known, its edges worn smooth by the constant unconscious handling of something you keep close because you can't figure out what to do with it, and you can't figure out how to put it down. He thought about a woman in Tennessee with a house and a garden and no family left. He thought about his son. He did not often think about his son. He had constructed the entire architecture of his daily mental life around the deliberate avoidance of thinking about his son, because thinking about his son led to the room he had closed and locked, the room that contained things he had done and things he had failed to do, and the outcome of both. His son's name was Marcus. He would be 29 years old now. Vance had been in Lovelock Correctional when the county moved Marcus to foster care, 18 months into a 7-year sentence, when the letter arrived written in the bureaucratic language of a system that processed human beings with the same procedural indifference it processed paperwork. Reading it had produced in Vance something he had no word for and had subsequently treated by the only method available to him, which was to put it in the room and close the door and continue existing. He had not found Marcus after his release. He had told himself it was because Marcus was better off not being found by the particular person Vance was. He had never fully examined whether this was genuine consideration for his son, or the more convenient truth that finding Marcus would have required opening the room, and he was not sure he could have survived what was in it. He looked at the office door at the end of the hallway. He thought about a girl who had learned the sounds of a building in an hour, who had shaken her head across the length of a bar with the quiet, complete certainty of someone who knew exactly what she needed, who had eaten everything on her plate. He folded the phone back into his pocket. Not yet. The call he was assembling required more than just the number and more than just the decision. It required the complete certain knowledge that he had exhausted every other option and that this was the right one. And he wasn't there. Not yet. He was thinking this sitting in the booth with the noise of the bar wrapping around him and the clock running when Steck raised his voice above the noise of the pool table. "Table," Steck said. "Now." It was not a request. The room reorganized itself with the practiced, unhurried speed of men who had been through this before, the patch members gravitating from wherever they were toward the long table at the back, pulling chairs settling. The prospects moved toward the walls. Whitlow produced another bottle without being asked. Vance sat in the booth for a moment. Then he stood up. He walked to the table and took his chair, the chair he'd occupied at this table for over a decade. Third from the left, the wood worn smooth in the specific places his arms rested. He sat and he looked around the table at the faces he'd known for varying lengths of time, in varying degrees of depth, and he felt the weight of what was about to happen settle across his shoulders with the full specific gravity of consequence. Steck sat at the head. He looked at the assembled members with his pale eyes and did not preamble. "We've got a situation that's gone from a one-night problem to a two-day exposure," Steck said. "County was here this morning. We've got a missing person report active in Elko. We've got a tweaker who got physical altercation charges filed today and whose statement puts him in the vicinity of this property." He looked around the table. "The child goes. Tonight. We put her in a vehicle and we take her to the nearest county facility and we call it in as a Good Samaritan report. Clean exit." He paused. "Unless someone has a different proposal." The silence ran. Vance looked at the tabletop. He felt the room's attention on him, the collective expectant awareness of men who knew this was his call to make and were waiting to see if he'd make it or if Steck would make it for him. He thought about what Steck had said in the booth. "You're not built for this." He thought about the specific ragged weight of Steck's voice when he'd said it, not triumphant, not cruel. Almost, if Vance was reading it right, something closer to tired. The tiredness of a man who had watched something coming for a long time and was sorry to see it arrive. Vance looked up from the table. "I have a proposal," he said. The room was quiet. He looked at Steck. "I have someone," Vance said, "outside the club, outside this state, someone who can take the kid clean, permanent, no county involvement, no paper trail that leads back here." He kept his voice level. "I need 48 hours to make the arrangement." Steck looked at him. "Who?" he said. "My sister," Vance said. The word landed in the table silence with a weight that surprised even him. The weight of a word he had not said aloud in this room, in any room in 22 years. A word that had existed in his private interior geography as a place on a map he had stopped looking at, a road he had stopped considering passable. No one at the table spoke. Steck held his gaze. The calculation in his pale eyes was running. Vance could see it, the processing of this new variable against the existing structure of the problem. A private placement, no county involvement, clean exit from the club's exposure, but also 48 more hours of the deputy's timeline, the Elko report, the active exposure. "You haven't spoken to this woman in," Steck started. "I know," Vance said. "And you think she'll—" "I don't know," Vance said. "That's why I need the 48 hours." The table was quiet. Then Briggs, from his chair to Vance's left, put both thick hands flat on the table and looked at Steck. He didn't say anything. He simply put his hands on the table and looked at Steck with the absolute immovable stillness of a wall that had decided it was not moving, and the gesture communicated everything it needed to communicate in the grammar that these men used instead of speeches. Whitlow, from his position near the bar, set down the glass he was holding. Steck looked at Briggs. He looked at Whitlow. He looked at the rest of the table running the count he didn't want to run because he already knew the answer. He looked at Vance. 48 hours, Steck said. His voice was flat and final. Not 49, not 48 and a half. He held Vance's gaze. You make the call tonight. Whatever answer you get, you work with it. And if you don't have a clean resolution by tomorrow night, I call county myself. Vance nodded. Then we're done, Steck said and stood, and the table dissolved back into the noise of the bar around it. Vance sat in his chair for a long moment after the other men had left it. He pulled the burner phone from his pocket. He held it in his hands. He opened the phone. He dialed the number from memory, the digits coming without effort, the way directions to a place come back to you. Even after a long absence, the body knowing the route the mind has convinced itself it's forgotten. He brought the phone to his ear. It rang once, twice, 3 times. He sat in the emptying bar with the neon buzzing and Whitlow wiping and the desert dark pressing against the dirty windows, and he waited to find out if the road he'd stopped traveling 22 years ago was still there. The phone rang 4 times, then 5. Vance sat in the booth with the burner pressed against his ear and listened to it ring the way you listen to something you've been putting off long enough that the putting off has become its own kind of answer, and you are only now in this specific moment finding out whether it was the right one. 6 rings. He was preparing the interior adjustment required to end the call, without resolution, the filing away of an attempt that hadn't produced an outcome, the return of the phone to his pocket when the line clicked. Silence. Not the silence of an unanswered phone, but the silence of a line that has been picked up. Then a voice. Hello. It was a woman's voice, low and careful, the single word delivered with the quality of someone answering a number they don't recognize at an hour that doesn't invite easy conversation. There was a Tennessee inflection in it, not heavy, not the performed drawl of someone leaning into their geography, just the subtle softening of certain vowels that accumulates in a person after enough years in one place and never fully leaves. He had not heard this voice in 22 years. It was recognizable in the way that things you knew before you were fully formed are always recognizable not through the recent updatable memory of a face you've seen recently, but through something older and more structural, laid down before the architecture of yourself was finished permanent in the way that early things are permanent. It's Vance, he said. The silence on the other end of the line changed quality. It was still silence. But it was a different silence now, a silence with weight and history, and the texture of 22 years of no contact suddenly being bridged by 2 words delivered in a voice that had aged, but not changed enough to be unrecognizable. He waited. I know who it is, Eugenia said. Her voice had not warmed. It had not cooled either. It had simply received the information and continued the voice of a woman who had spent 22 years preparing in the abstract for this call, and was now finding that preparation and reality were 2 different things. Vance held the phone and looked at the tabletop and said nothing for a moment. I'm not calling to explain, he said, and I'm not calling to make anything right. I know there's no making it right. Another silence, shorter. Then why are you calling? Eugenia said. I have a child, Vance said. He heard something shift on the other end of the line, a small physical adjustment, the sound of a person changing their relationship to what they're hearing. Not surprise exactly. More the sound of someone encountering something they hadn't predicted and taking a moment to reorient. Yours, she asked. No, Vance said. 7 years old. Girl. She was brought in out of a bad situation. There's nobody safe to send her back to, and the county system is the other available option, and the county system will put her back in the same situation in 6 months. He paused. I need a place for her, somewhere clean, somewhere nobody from here can reach, somewhere she can be safe. The word felt inadequate. It was the only one he had. The silence on the line was longer this time. He could hear faintly the ambient sound of a house, the particular textured quiet of an indoor space at night, the refrigerator cycling, a fan somewhere. "What do you mean brought in?" Eugenia said. "She ran in," Vance said. "Into the bar. She was being chased by the man who'd been hitting her. She hid under my table." He looked at the booth, at the shadows under the table where Della had been crammed against the wall with her knees to her chest. "She grabbed my leg." He did not elaborate on this. He did not try to explain what had happened after it, because the explanation was either already sufficient or it wasn't, and adding to it would not change which one it was. The silence ran. "How long ago?" Eugenia asked. "Yesterday afternoon." "And she's been there since?" "Yes." Another silence. When Eugenia spoke again, the register had shifted slightly, still careful, still guarded, but carrying underneath it now something he recognized as the sound of someone thinking about something rather than deciding about something. The difference was meaningful. "What happened to her?" she said. Not a question exactly. More an invitation to complete a picture she was already beginning to assemble. Vance told her. He told her about the bruise in the closet and the bicycle and the peanut butter sandwich and the gray eyes running their constant calculation and the small hand clamped around his leg with a force that had nothing to do with size. He told her about Pruitt in the parking lot and Crandall's card on the table and the clock Steck had put on the situation and the 48 hours he'd walked away from the table with. He told it the way he told things, without inflection, without reaching for effect, just the facts assembled in their order. He had never learned how to make things sound worse than they were, and he had never learned how to make them sound better. He just said what had happened, the way an engine either runs or it doesn't, and the sound of it is the answer. When he was done, Eugenia was quiet. "What's her name?" she said. "Della," he said. He heard the small sound of Eugenia exhaling. "Give me until morning," she said. He almost said something to that. He almost said he didn't have until morning, that the clock was already where it was, and morning was exactly when it ran out. He stopped himself. She had said, "Give me until morning," and that was a different thing than "I need to think about it." And he knew the difference even after 22 years of not speaking to the person saying it. "All right," he said. "Don't call again tonight," she said. "I'll call you." The line closed. Vance held the dead phone in his hand for a moment. Then he folded it and put it in his pocket and sat in the booth in the loud, complicated darkness of the roadhouse and waited. He did not sleep. He sat in the booth until the bar closed down around him. The gradual, staggered departure of members, the dimming of lights, the final song on the jukebox running out, the silence reasserting itself in stages until the room was down to just the hum of the refrigeration units and the distant pulse of the interstate, and Whitlow doing his last wipe down of the bar in the dark. At some point past 2 in the morning, he got up and walked to the office and opened the door quietly and looked in. Della was asleep on the sofa under the gray wool blanket, her position the same compressed comma it had been the previous night, her breathing the deep, even rhythm of genuine rest. The bruise on her cheek had darkened further, the colors deep and definitive. Her left eye was more swollen than it had been at dinner, the lid thickened and heavy. He stood in the doorway and looked at her for a while. He thought about Marcus, about being 23 years old and trying with everything he had and still ending up in a correctional facility while the county moved the boy to a foster family in Reno. The distance between the trying and the outcome had been the exact measure of what he was built for and what he wasn't. He looked at Della's sleeping face. He thought about what she had said about the closet, about the window screen pushed out in the dark, about running without direction, just away, just out, just anywhere that wasn't the apartment with the broken deadbolt. He went back to the main room and sat in his booth until dawn. The phone rang at 5:47 in the morning. He had it open before the second ring. "I have a room," Eugenia said. No preamble, no ceremony, just the fact delivered in the same careful low voice that had said hello at the other end of 10 rings last night. Vance closed his eyes briefly. "It was my sewing room," she said. "I haven't used it in years. There's a bed frame in there, and I can get a mattress this morning at the Goodwill in Cookville. They get them in on Thursdays. She paused. The yard is fenced. The school district out here is decent. The neighbor 2 doors down watches her grandkids every day after school and has been asking me for years if I knew anyone who needed childcare. So there's that. She said all of this in the tone of a person who had spent the night making a list and was now reading from it, methodical, thorough, the planning of someone who, having decided a thing, committed to its logistics with full attention. Eugenia, Vance said. Don't, she said. The word was not harsh. It was the word of someone who had processed the harder parts of this decision alone in the night without him, and had arrived at a place where she knew what she needed and what she didn't, and what she didn't need was his gratitude performed in real time over a phone. How long can you drive today, she said. I'm not driving her, he said. I'll find something cleaner, but I want to meet you at the handoff point. A pause. She absorbed this. Then however you're moving her, make sure she eats before you go, Eugenia said. And bring whatever she has. Clothes, toys, whatever. She doesn't have much, Vance said. A pause. Then we'll get her some, Eugenia said. The line held for a moment, just the ambient sound of the Tennessee morning on her end and the Nevada Roadhouse pre-dawn on his, the two spaces connected by the thin, unlikely thread of a call he had not made in 22 years. Eugene, he said. Don't, she said again. Softer this time. Not a prohibition. A protection for herself, for him, for the fragile thing that had just been rebuilt enough to carry weight and did not yet need to carry more than it was already carrying. I'll call when we have a meeting point, he said. All right, she said. The line closed. Vance sat in the booth in the early morning quiet and held the phone in both hands and breathed. Then he stood up, put the phone in his pocket, and went to find Whitlow. The morning moved with a speed disproportionate to how slowly the previous 18 hours had moved. The way time compresses when you are finally in motion after a long period of stillness, the hours that had dragged like pulled rope suddenly running freely. He told Briggs first. Not the details. Briggs didn't need the details, and Briggs would not have asked for them. Just it's handled, she's moving today clean. Briggs absorbed this with his characteristic stillness, nodded once and went back to his coffee with the manner of a man whose contribution to a situation had been exactly what was required and who required no acknowledgement of it. Before he told Steck, there was one other thing to handle. Crandall had called at 6:15. Vance had taken it outside, standing on the loading dock in the early morning cool. Pruitt was in county holding an Elko booked on assault and child endangerment charges. Nadine Foss had signed the paperwork. Crandall delivered this information in the same patient, unhurried voice he delivered all information, and he did not ask Vance any questions, and Vance did not offer anything. And when the call was done, Crandall simply said, "Clock still running," and disconnected. The machine Vance had spent his life avoiding had on this one occasion done the thing it was designed to do. He told Steck second. He found the VP at the pool table at 7 in the morning running solitary practice shots with the focused mechanical attention of a man who used physical repetition as a thinking tool. Vance stood at the edge of the table and waited for Steck to look up. Steck looked up. I made the call, Vance said. I have a placement. She moves today. Pruitt's in county holding an Elko as of this morning assault and child endangerment. Nadine Foss filed the paperwork herself. Steck looked at him for a long moment. The pale eyes ran their calculation. Then he set the cue down flat on the table. Clean, he said. Clean, Vance said. Steck nodded. He picked up his cue again. He lined up the next shot. Clock stops, Steck said. You're called to manage the exit. I don't want to know the specifics. He took the shot. The crack of ball on ball echoed in the morning quiet. Vance walked away from the pool table. He went to the office and knocked. It's Vance, he said. The latch turned and the door opened, and Della looked up at him with her gray eye and her watchful, careful face, and the gray wool blanket still pulled around her shoulders against the morning cool. Get your shoes on, he said. We're going somewhere. She looked at him steadily. Where, she asked. Somewhere better than here, he said. She held his gaze for a moment, running the assessment. Then she sat down on the sofa and reached under it for her canvas sneakers and began putting them on, threading the two long laces through the eyelets with small, careful fingers. She tied them in double knots the way someone had taught her, he assumed at some point before the current chapter of her life had overwritten most of the ordinary things. When she was done, she stood up and looked around the office once. At the battered desk, the filing cabinet, the brown leather sofa with its impression of her weight still in it. She looked at it the way you look at a place you didn't choose to be and wouldn't choose to return to, but which was for a specific window of time the place that stood between you and something worse. She picked up the gray wool blanket from the sofa. She held it out toward Vance, an offering, the returning of a borrowed thing. He looked at it. "Keep it," he said. She folded it carefully against her chest and followed him out of the office and into the morning. Briggs had a contact, a woman in Winnemucca who ran a legitimate transport operation and who had done careful business with the club for years, and who understood when Briggs called her at 7:15 in the morning that this was a different kind of transport and that the careful in careful business applied here in full. The woman's name was Dolores, and she arrived at the Roadhouse at 9 in a plain white van with no markings and a child's booster seat already installed in the rear, which she had procured somewhere between Winnemucca and the Roadhouse in the 2 hours since Briggs's call, and which communicated more clearly than anything she said that she was a person who understood what situations required and acquired the requirements without being asked twice. Vance watched Della look at the booster seat. He watched something move across her face, the collision of a child's instinctive recognition of something designed for children and the more guarded, more recent knowledge that things that look safe were not always safe. She stood at the open side door of the van and looked at the booster seat and then at Vance. "Who is she?" Della asked, meaning Dolores. "Someone I trust," Vance said. Della looked at Dolores. Dolores was somewhere in her mid-40s, broad-shouldered with an expression of complete undemonstrative practicality. She looked at Della with neither excessive warmth nor excessive seriousness, just the straightforward regard of a capable person encountering a task and proceeding with it. "I've got water and trail mix in the console," Dolores said to Della in the tone of someone communicating logistics rather than comfort. "Seat's got a cup holder on the right side." Della looked at the cup holder. She looked at Vance. She climbed into the booster seat. "She's taking you to meet someone," Vance told her. "I'll be there when you arrive." Della looked at him from the booster seat. Her feet didn't reach the floor. She was holding the folded gray blanket in her lap. "Promise?" she asked. He held her gaze. "Yes," he said. Dolores looked at him once briefly with the complete informational regard of someone confirming that the handoff had been made and the task was now hers. She slid the side door partially closed, leaving it unlatched, not locked, never locked, and walked around to the driver's seat. The van pulled out of the lot and turned east onto Old 40 and moved into the burning Nevada morning. Vance walked to his bike. He rode east. The Nevada desert unrolled on every side of him, pale and enormous, and indifferent, the sage flats running out to the distant smudge of mountains in every direction. The sky above it, the flat, merciless white of July at altitude. The interstate ran beside Old 40 for miles before diverging, and he could see the trucks moving on it in the middle distance, anonymous and constant, the endless mechanical migration of commerce across the continent. He rode with the throttle steady and the wind hitting his face, and the roadhouse falling behind him, and the road ahead running straight and clear toward the Utah line. He was thinking about Eugenia. He was thinking about the 22 years of silence, and what had lived in that silence, and what had survived it, and what hadn't. He was thinking about a sewing room in Tennessee with a bed frame, and a Goodwill mattress, and a fenced yard, and a neighbor who watched grandchildren after school. He was thinking about the way Eugenia had said, "Give me until morning," the specific quality of that phrase, the difference between it and "I need to think about it." He was thinking about Marcus. He let himself think about Marcus for the first time in a long time. Not the room, not what was in the room, but just the fact of him. 29 years old somewhere in the world, possibly with a life that Vance knew nothing about and had no place in. possibly without. The not knowing was the thing that lived most persistently in the room, not the guilt, not the grief, but the simple permanent fact of not knowing. He could not undo that. He rode for an hour before he saw the van pulled over at the meeting point, a wide gravel turnout at a rest area just past the Nevada-Utah line, where a single wooden picnic table sat under a metal roof shade structure and a coin-operated water dispenser hummed in the heat. And beside the van, standing in the shade, was a woman he had not seen in 22 years. Eugenia was 58 years old, and she looked like their mother in a way that Vance had not been prepared for and did not have adequate defenses against. She was not tall. She had the same light eyes as him, the same set of the jaw, the same quality of stillness that their family carried as a trait, the way other families carried eye color. She was wearing plain clothes, jeans, a cotton shirt, nothing performative, and she was standing with her arms at her sides in the flat, patient posture of someone who has been waiting for something for a very long time and has learned that patience is not a feeling but a practice. She was looking at him as he pulled in and cut the engine. She did not smile. She did not wave. She simply stood there and let him arrive. He got off the bike. He walked toward her across the gravel and stopped a few feet away, and they looked at each other across 22 years of silence and the specific, complicated weight of everything that had accumulated in it. He did not say he was sorry. He had told her on the phone he wasn't calling to make anything right, and he had meant it, and she had heard him mean it, and performing it now in the gravel of a rest area in the July heat would have been the worst possible way to honor the honesty of that. "You look like hell," Eugenia said. "I know," he said. They stood there for a moment longer. Then Eugenia looked past him at the van. Dolores had opened the side door and Della was climbing out the gray blanket folded in her arms, her double-knotted shoes landing on the gravel with a small, precise sound. Della looked at Eugenia. Eugenia looked at Della. And then Eugenia reached back to the car behind her, a plain sedan rental plates from a Cookville agency, and she lifted something from the back seat and carried it forward. It was a bicycle. Pink, new, the handlebars wrapped in white tape, and from each grip a cluster of white streamers hanging loose and bright in the desert wind. Vance had not told her about the bicycle. He had told her about the bruise in the closet and the peanut butter sandwich and the small hand clamped around his leg. He had not told her about the bicycle. He did not know when she had figured it out, or how or what she had done with the figuring once she had it. He did not ask. Della stood in the gravel of the rest area and looked at the bicycle. She looked at it for a long time. She looked at the pink frame, the white streamers moving in the hot desert air. She looked at the handlebars, the way the streamers were arranged, two clusters, one on each side, the white tape catching the light. She looked at Vance. He said nothing. She looked back at the bicycle. Then she looked at Eugenia. Eugenia held the bicycle out to her with both hands, the way you offer something that is simply being returned to its proper owner without ceremony and without the performance of generosity. "It's got streamers," Eugenia said. Della set down the gray blanket on the gravel. She walked forward and took the bicycle from Eugenia's hands and held it by the handlebars and stood with it in the July desert light and was very still. Then she turned and looked at Vance one more time. He walked toward her and he crouched down to her level, his bad knees announcing themselves in the full, unambiguous language of 52 years, and he looked at her face. The bruise was still there, still vivid, still telling its ugly story about where she had come from. But her eyes, her gray eyes, were doing something different than they had been doing since the moment she'd first looked up at him from under the table. They were not calculating. They were just looking. "Nobody touches you anymore," Vance said. He said it the way he said things he had decided were true, without inflection, without the upward lilt of a reassurance or a promise, a statement of fact about a future that had already been determined. Della looked at him. Then she reached out with one hand, the hand not on the handlebar, and she pressed her palm flat against the front of his cut just below the death's head. Patch the same spot she'd touched in the booth 2 days ago. Not desperate, not anchoring. The deliberate, conscious choice to make contact before contact was no longer possible. He put his hand over hers, his scarred, heavy palm covering her small one completely. They stayed like that for 3 seconds. Then she drew her hand back and put it on the handlebar and looked forward toward Eugenia, toward the sedan, with the rental plates and the road that led east from this place toward Tennessee, and a sewing room and a fenced yard. Okay, she said. One word, small, simple. The sound of a person who has done the arithmetic and found that the terms as stated were the best available. Vance stood. He looked at Eugenia over Della's head. Eugenia was watching him with the light eyes they'd inherited from the same people, in the same small house, in a town neither of them had been back to in 30 years. Her expression communicated nothing except what it always had, the patient, complete, unsentimental regard of someone who understood the situation fully and had already decided what to do about it. He nodded once. She nodded once. Then she reached down and took the bicycle from Della's hands gently, with the reassurance of someone who is not removing something, but temporarily managing something, and she opened the trunk of the sedan and laid it carefully inside. She closed the trunk. She opened the rear door. Della looked at the open door. She looked at Vance one more time. "Will you?" she started. "No," he said. He said it the same way he'd said it before, without softening, because the truth without softening was the thing she deserved from him. "But you've got her." He tilted his head toward Eugenia. "That's better." Della held his gaze for a moment. Then she got in the car. Eugenia closed the door behind her. She walked around to the driver's side. She opened her door and paused and looked at Vance across the roof of the car. He stood in the gravel with his hands at his sides, in the July heat pressing down, in the desert running out in every direction around them. "I'll let you know when we're there," she said. "All right," he said. She got in the car. The engine started. The car pulled out of the rest area and turned east onto Old 40 and moved away into the desert, and Vance stood in the gravel and watched it go, and watched it grow smaller, and watched it become a shape, and then a point, and then nothing, absorbed into the white shimmer of the heat on the horizon, the way everything eventually got absorbed by the desert if you waited long enough. He stood there for a while. The wind came across the sage flats and moved through the streamers of his cut, and brought the smell of pine from somewhere up in the mountains to the north. A hawk rode a thermal in slow circles over the rest area, watching the ground below, with the patient, impersonal attention of something that has no opinion about what it sees and simply sees it. Vance looked at the empty horizon where the car had been. Then he walked back to his bike. He sat on it for a moment without starting the engine. He looked west, back the way he'd come back toward Nevada, back toward the roadhouse sitting in its patch of sage off the interstate, back toward the booth in the back corner, where the neon light from the front window gave up its reach, and the shadows settled thick and permanent. He reached into his cut pocket. He pulled out the burner phone. He looked at it in his hand. Then he put it back in his pocket, started the engine, and turned the bike west. The ride back was different from the ride out. The same desert, the same road, the same white sky, but the weight of it was distributed differently across his shoulders. Not lighter, not resolved, but reconfigured in some way that made it sit differently than it had for the past 48 hours. Or the past 20 years. He did not examine this too closely. He was not a man who benefited from close examination of things that were better left to settle on their own. He rode. He rode through the midday heat, in the long, pale silence of the Nevada flats, in the distant metallic shimmer of the highway traffic running its constant, anonymous course. And he thought about nothing in particular and everything at once in the specific, unfocused way that only happened on the bike when the road took over enough of the body's attention that the mind was left free to do whatever it needed to do without being supervised. He thought about Della's double-knotted laces on the gravel. He thought about the way she had eaten everything on the plate. He thought about her finger on the road map, tracing the interstates from city to city, following the lines that connected places to other places. He thought about a sewing room in Tennessee, a bed frame, a Goodwill mattress, a neighbor who watched grandchildren after school. He thought about Eugenia's hands on the bicycle, the way she had held it out simply without ceremony, the returning of something to its proper owner. He thought about Marcus. He thought about 29 years old somewhere in the world. He thought about doors that were closed and whether they were closed permanently or only until someone decided to open them. He rode. The roadhouse came into view off the highway exit at 1:45 in the afternoon, its low dark profile against the pale sage, the corrugated steel catching the sun, the neon Coors sign doing its small, persistent flicker in the front window. The parking lot was half full, the familiar scatter of bikes and trucks arranged in their habitual configurations. He turned off the highway and came down the gravel approach and parked in his usual spot and cut the engine. He sat on the bike for a moment. Then he went inside. The roadhouse received him the way it always received him, with the ambient stench of stale beer and pine floor wax, with the low hum of the refrigeration units and the muted sound of the jukebox doing its afternoon work, with the unhurried rhythm of Whitlow behind the bar, performing his slow meditative maintenance on the oak surface. Three members at the back, Briggs at his corner, the usual arrangement of the usual afternoon. Steck was at the pool table. He looked up when Vance came in, held his gaze for 1 second, and looked back at his shot. He took it. The balls dispersed across the felt in their particular, unrepeatable pattern. Vance walked to the back booth. He sat down. The cracked red vinyl, the yellow foam showing through the old knife wounds in the upholstery. The sticky tabletop, the scarred wood beneath the permanent geography of a place he had occupied for 19 years. He looked at the space across from him. The slight compression in the vinyl still visible, the particular impression left by a small person who had sat there for 2 days with her knees pulled up and her hands folded in her lap, and her watchful gray eyes reading the room with the thoroughness of someone for whom reading was survival. He looked at it for a while. Then Whitlow appeared at the edge of the booth. He set down a mug of black coffee with his characteristic precise economy. No spill, no ceremony, no comment. He turned and walked away. Vance wrapped his hands around the mug. The coffee was hot. The heat moved through the ceramic into his aching knuckles, filling the space where the cold had been. He held it in both hands and let the warmth do what it could. The roadhouse settled around him in its familiar permanent way. The dim, dusty air, the scarred tables, the faded pool felt, the neon Coors sign beginning its morning flicker as the power fluctuated in the building's aging wiring. The smell of stale beer and pine floor wax and old tobacco that had been present in this room so long, it was no longer a smell, but a condition as ambient and unremarkable as gravity. He had been sitting in this room, in this booth, for 19 years. He would probably sit in this room, in this booth, for however many years remain, because this was the room he had, and this was the booth he used, and this was the life he had built, with the materials available to him. And you did not unmake a life at 52 any more than you unmade an engine block by looking at it and deciding you wanted it to be something else. He knew that. He had always known that. But sitting in the booth with the hot mug in his aching hands on this particular afternoon, he was aware of something that had not been present in the same way the day before yesterday, or the day before that, or any of the days in the recent succession of days that had preceded the one where a small girl had slammed through his door and crammed herself under his table and grabbed his leg with both hands and held on. The booth felt different. Not emptier, it had never been full, not in any sense he'd been counting, but differently empty. The way a room feels differently empty after something has been in it than it did before. His phone vibrated in his cut pocket. He pulled it out. The burner. A text message, not a call, just words on a small screen arriving from somewhere east of the Utah line. It said Tennessee in 6 hours. She's asleep. Bike is in the trunk. Dolores. He looked at the words on the small screen. He thought about Della asleep in the back seat with the gray blanket folded in her lap, and the pink bicycle in the trunk, and the miles of American highway running beneath the wheels, connecting Nevada to Utah to Colorado, to the long, green, unhurried geography of Tennessee. He thought about the lines on the road map she had traced with one careful finger. He put the phone back in his pocket. He picked up his coffee and drank. It was hot and bitter and exactly what it was. The same coffee, the same mug, the same booth, the same bar on the same stretch of old Nevada highway, and nothing about it had changed, and everything about the afternoon he was drinking it in had. The jukebox clicked on. Someone had fed it quarters, Briggs probably moving through the room in the quiet way he moved, doing the things that needed doing without commentary or acknowledgement. The first notes of something slow and heavy moved out of the speakers, a long guitar line that trailed through the empty room and reached the back booth and settled there like weather settling over open country. Vance sat in the back booth of the Roadhouse with his coffee and his aching hands and the full quiet weight of everything that had happened in the past 48 hours, and he let the music run. Outside, the Nevada afternoon burned on in its absolute indifferent way, the sky white with heat, the sage flats stretching to the mountains in every direction, the highway moving its constant, anonymous traffic from one horizon to the other. The Roadhouse sat in the middle of it, the way it had always sat, low and weathered and unnamed, a specific point in the geography of a specific stretch of American nowhere, unremarkable to everyone who drove past it, and permanent to the small number of people whose lives had, for better or worse, come to orbit it. Vance did not think about tomorrow. He was not a man who thought about tomorrow with any productive frequency. Tomorrow was the same as today in the ways that mattered. The same booth, the same coffee, the same accumulated weight of a life lived in a particular way, according to a particular set of principles, and the slow daily maintenance of those principles against the various forces that pushed against them. What was different was this. He looked at the empty bench across from him. Steck was right in the sense that Steck was usually right about operational realities. Vance was not built for gentleness. He was not built for the sustained patient work of caring for something fragile. He was not built for the daily, undramatic, endlessly demanding work of being a presence in someone's life that they could count on. He had tried once. He had been 23, and he had tried with everything he had, and he had still ended up in a correctional facility while the county moved his son to a foster family in Reno. The distance between the trying and the outcome had been the exact measure of what he was built for and what he wasn't. So Steck was right. But Steck's version of the analysis stopped at the wrong place. The question was not whether Vance was built for it. The question was whether a 7-year-old girl with double-knotted laces and a gray blanket and a pink bicycle with white streamers, and the survival intelligence that only comes from having needed it, absolutely had been put somewhere better than where she'd started. He looked at the empty bench across from him. She had. That was enough. It was in the economy of what he was built for, and what he could produce exactly enough, not more, not the full measure of what a child deserved, not the complete accounting of what he owed a world he had spent 30 years taking things from. But enough for this afternoon. Enough to put his hands flat on the table and sit with the quiet of it, without the ache behind his sternum demanding something he didn't have. The jukebox played its slow, heavy music into the empty room. The neon sign buzzed its red light through the dusty air. The refrigeration units hummed their low, constant hum beneath everything. His hands were flat on the table. His coffee was getting cold. Outside, the desert ran on without end, in every direction, pale and enormous and indifferent, the way it had always run and the way it would continue to run long after the Roadhouse, and everyone who had ever sat inside it, had been absorbed back into the dust and the heat and the long, patient silence of the American West. Vance sat in the back booth and drank his cold coffee and did not hold on to anything. For the first time in a very long time, there was nothing in the space across from him that needed holding. He let that be what it was.